The desert wind howled across the Arizona territory like a wounded animal carrying clouds of red dust that stung the eyes and abraded the skin. Holt Morgan pulled his bandana higher over his weathered face, squinting through the haze at the barely visible trail before him. At 62, most men would have been sitting on a porch somewhere, not riding through a sandstorm in pursuit of a ghost from the past. But Holt Morgan was not most men. His leather-gloved hand tightened around the reins as his horse, a sturdy chestnut Mustang named Rusty, balked at pushing further into the storm. 15 years of vengeance delayed was enough to make any man impatient, but Holt had learned the hard way that rushing led to mistakes, and Vernon Hargrove had eluded justice far too long for Holt to make mistakes now. "Just a little further, old boy," he murmured, patting Rusty's neck. "Trail's still fresh." The horse snorted skeptically, its ears flicking back and forth as the wind shifted. Through gaps in the swirling dust, Holt could see the distinctive boot prints he'd been following since dawn. Hargrove and his men had passed this way no more than 3 hours ago, heading southwest toward the border. If Holt kept this pace, he might catch them by nightfall. 15 years since the massacre. 15 years of nightmares and guilt, and a thirst for justice that water could not quench. A sudden gust swept across the plain, momentarily clearing the air. Holt reined in Rusty, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he spotted something in the distance, a dark shape sprawled across the sand that didn't belong. "What in God's name?" he muttered, urging his horse forward with gentle pressure from his knees. As he drew closer, the shape resolved into a human form. A woman lying face down in the sand, her long black hair tangled with dust, and what looked distressingly like dried blood. She wore tattered clothes that might once have been a traditional Apache dress, now ripped and stained. Even from his saddle, Holt could see the angry purple welts crisscrossing her back and shoulders, the unmistakable marks of a whip. Holt's jaw tightened beneath his bandana. The woman's wrists were bound with leather thongs suggesting she'd been tied up, and then either escaped or been left to die. From the stillness of her form, he feared the latter. For a moment, he sat motionless in his saddle, torn between two imperatives. The trail he'd been following was growing fainter by the minute, as the sandstorm obscured it. If he stopped now, Hargrove might slip away again, perhaps for another 15 years or forever. But the woman before him would be dead within hours, if left alone. "Damn it all to hell," Holt growled, swinging down from his horse with a groan as his old bones protested. He knelt beside the woman, gently turning her over. Her face was strong-featured and striking, despite being caked with dust and marked with bruises. Her breathing was shallow, barely perceptible, but she was alive. Holt's fingers sought the pulse at her neck, faint but present. Behind him, the wind shifted again, and when he looked back, he could no longer see the boot prints he'd been following. The desert had swallowed Hargrove's trail. Holt closed his eyes briefly, a muscle working in his jaw. Then he drew his knife and sliced through the leather binding her wrists. With a grunt of effort that spoke of his age, he hoisted the woman over his shoulder. She was surprisingly heavy, solid, with muscle beneath her torn clothing. "Sorry, Rusty," he murmured to his horse as he draped the unconscious woman across the saddle. "Extra burden today." Mounting behind her, Holt took one last look in the direction Hargrove had gone, then turned his horse toward home. The hunt would have to wait. As they rode away, the red dust swirled around them like blood in water, obscuring their passage from any watching eyes. The scent of dust, sweat, and dried blood mingled in Holt's nostrils, a bitter perfume that reminded him of days he'd spent decades trying to forget. He did not look back again. The desert kept its secrets, and Holt Morgan had just made a choice that would change everything. The cabin stood alone on a small rise-weathered wood, silvered by years of desert sun. A lone oak tree, gnarled and stubborn, provided meager shade for the small corral, where Rusty now drank gratefully from a trough. The land around was harsh, but not barren. Holt had carved out a modest living from it over the years, raising a small herd of cattle and growing what crops the arid soil would support. Inside, the wounded Apache woman lay on Holt's own bed, still unconscious. He'd cleaned her wounds as best he could, using skills learned long ago on battlefields best forgotten. The welts on her back would heal in time, though some would surely leave scars. What concerned him more was her dehydration and the fever that had begun to burn through her like wildfire. Holt wrung out a cloth in cool water and placed it on her forehead, his movements methodical and careful. He'd spent enough time among the Apache to know their ways enough to respect this woman's strength. Whatever she'd endured, she'd survived when most would have perished. Night had fallen, and the cabin was lit by the golden glow of an oil lamp and the flickering light from the fireplace. Outside, the wind had finally died down, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Satisfied he'd done all he could for now, Holt moved to a small desk in the corner of the one-room cabin. From a locked drawer, he withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and dog-eared from frequent handling. The journal fell open naturally to the most recent entry dated the previous day. Holt dipped his pen in ink and began to write his spidery handwriting, filling the page April 15, 1885. I found Hargrove's trail today, heading southwest through Rattlesnake Pass. After 15 years, the man still favors the same routes. Some habits never die, though the men who hold them surely do. Got close enough to see smoke from his camp last night. 4 men with him, all armed. One I recognized as Preston Reed, a gun for hire, who rode with Hargrove's Rangers during the war. The others are strangers to me, younger men with hard eyes. Tomorrow should be the day. God willing, I'll finally look Hargrove in the eye and make him answer for what we did at Whispering Creek. Holt paused, pen hovering over the page, as memories flooded back unbidden. The screams, the gunfire, the smell of burning wickiups, women and children running in terror as men fell around them, and Hargrove standing in the midst of it all, a smile on his face, as though he were at a county fair rather than a slaughter. Holt forced his hand to continue writing. Found a woman in the desert today. Apache badly beaten and left to die. Had to choose between following Hargrove and saving her. The trail is lost now, at least until I can pick it up again. Don't know who she is or why she was out there, but the whip marks on her back remind me too much of other cruelties I've witnessed. Some at Hargrove's hand, some at my own. May God forgive me, though I don't deserve it. He set down the pen and flipped back through earlier pages, stopping at an entry from years before. A small daguerreotype was affixed to the page, a smiling woman with kind eyes holding a little girl of perhaps 4 years. His wife Margaret and their daughter Hannah. Both 5 years in their graves, now taken by the influenza that had swept through the territory like a scythe. Miss you both still, he whispered to the image. Every damn day. From the bed came a soft moan. Holt quickly closed the journal and returned it to the drawer, locking it with a small key he kept on a chain around his neck. Some secrets were too heavy to share, too dark to expose to the light. He moved back to the bedside, checking the Apache woman's fever. Still high, but perhaps a touch lower than before. As he adjusted the blanket covering her, his gaze fell on the photograph that stood on his bedside table himself, in a younger day, wearing an Army Scout's uniform, standing beside a group of hard-eyed men. The infamous Grey Wolves, a special unit tasked with missions too brutal or too questionable for regular Army units. His fingers moved unconsciously to touch the small tattoo on the inside of his left wrist, a stylized wolf's head, the mark of his former unit. A reminder of what he had been, what he had done. Holt turned away from the photograph and reached for his harmonica, an old battered thing that had been with him longer than anything else he owned. Sitting in the wooden chair beside the bed, he began to play softly a melancholy tune that drifted through the cabin like smoke, a song of regret and remembrance. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the burdens of the man who watched them through the cabin's single window or to the wounded woman whose life now rested in his weathered hands. Dawn broke over the Arizona territory, painting the desert in hues of gold and amber. Holt had dozed off in the chair beside the bed, his harmonica still clutched loosely in one hand. A sudden movement jolted him awake, years of battlefield vigilance snapping his consciousness to full alertness in an instant. The Apache woman was awake, her dark eyes wide and wild with fear and confusion. Before Holt could speak, she lunged for the small knife he kept on the bedside table, her movements surprisingly quick and fluid, despite her injuries. Steel flashed in the early morning light as she rolled off the bed and backed against the wall, the knife held before her in a grip that spoke of experience. Her chest heaved with exertion, sweat beading on her forehead from the effort and the lingering fever. Holt remained seated, making no sudden movements. He slowly raised both hands, palms out, in a universal gesture of peace. "Duoda nanilkad," he said softly in Apache. "Don't be afraid." Surprise flickered across the woman's face, quickly masked by suspicion. "Hush, Yiniuta," she demanded. "What do you want, Nichi Anahodilza?" Holt replied, his accent rough but understandable. "To help you heal." The woman's eyes narrowed, darting around the cabin, taking in the single room with its sparse furnishings, the door that stood unlocked, the windows unbarred. Not a prison, then. Her gaze returned to Holt, studying him intently. "You speak the language of my people," she said in English, her voice low and musical despite its hoarseness. "Where did you learn it?" "From a friend long ago," Holt answered slowly, lowering his hands. "I found you in the desert yesterday, during the sandstorm. You were close to death." She glanced down at her bandaged wrists, then touched her back, gingerly, feeling the poultices Holt had applied to the worst of the whip marks. "You treated my wounds." It wasn't a question, but Holt nodded anyway. "Did what I could. Name's Holt Morgan. This is my ranch." He gestured around the cabin. "Such as it is." The woman remained silent, the knife still held defensively before her. "If you're going to stab me," Holt said with a hint of dry humor, "do it clean. But if you want to live, you might want to reconsider. That fever of yours isn't beaten yet." A long moment passed between them, the silence broken only by the distant lowing of Holt's small herd of cattle. Finally, the woman lowered the knife, though she kept it in her grip. "Ayasha," she said simply. Holt nodded, accepting the offering of her name. "Ayasha, you need rest and water. There's food when you're ready." He nodded toward a pot of stew simmering on the small stove. "That door isn't locked. You want to leave? I won't stop you. But out there's nothing but hot sand and vultures for 20 miles in any direction." Ayasha's shoulders sagged slightly, the brief surge of energy that had propelled her defensive actions fading. She sank down onto the edge of the bed, the knife now resting loosely in her lap. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine confusion. A white man helping an Apache woman. It is not common. Holt's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered in his gray eyes, a shadow of old pain quickly suppressed. "Maybe I'm not common," he said, simply rising from his chair with a slight wince as his old bones protested. "Rest. I'll be outside tending to chores." Yell if you need anything." Without waiting for a response, he moved to the door and stepped out onto the small porch, leaving Ayesha alone with her thoughts and questions. From the bed, Ayesha watched through the open door as Holt moved across the yard toward the corral, his movements those of a man accustomed to physical labor despite his age. Her gaze shifted around the cabin, taking in details she had missed in her initial panic: the neatly kept space, the few personal possessions. Her eyes fell on the desk in the corner and the drawer that Holt had locked before leaving. Something about it called to her a whisper of intuition that had served her well as a healer and medicine woman among her people. That drawer held secrets, and secrets Ayesha knew well could be both weapons and shields. She looked down at the knife still clutched in her hand, then at the bandages on her wrists and the poultices on her wounds. This white man, this Holt Morgan, had saved her life. For now, that would have to be enough to trust him. But as she laid the knife aside and settled back against the pillows, her eyes returned to the locked drawer. Sooner or later, she would discover what it contained. Survival had taught her that knowledge was often the difference between life and death. Outside, Holt Morgan leaned against the corral fence, watching his small herd graze in the distance. His weathered face betrayed nothing of his thoughts, but his hand moved unconsciously to the key hanging around his neck. 15 years of carrying the burden of Whispering Creek. 15 years of hunting Vernon Hargrove. And now a wounded Apache woman with eyes that seemed to see too much. The wheel of fate had begun to turn, and Holt Morgan could only hold on and see where it would take him. 3 days passed in an uneasy truce. Ayesha's fever broke on the second day, and her strength returned with surprising speed. By the third morning, she was up and moving around the cabin, her movements still careful but no longer hindered by weakness. Holt had given her one of his shirts to replace her tattered dress, and though it hung like a sack on her frame, it was clean and whole. They spoke little, existing in a careful dance of shared space. Holt slept on a bedroll near the fireplace, giving Ayesha the bed until she was fully recovered. On the afternoon of the third day, Holt returned from checking his cattle to find Ayesha at the stove stirring a pot that filled the cabin with unfamiliar but enticing aromas. "Found herbs near the creek," she explained without being asked. "Good for healing. Made tea and stew." Holt nodded, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Obliged," he said simply. As he washed his hands in the basin, he caught Ayesha watching him with those penetrating dark eyes. There was something assessing in her gaze that made him uneasy, as though she were trying to read secrets written on his soul. "Your shoulder pains you," she observed. "Old wound." Holt's hand moved unconsciously to his right shoulder, where an old bullet wound ached in changing weather. "Apache arrow, actually. Long time ago." A ghost of a smile touched Ayesha's lips. "Not good shot, then. Apache aim for heart." Holt found himself almost smiling in return. "He was plenty good. I was just faster." Ayesha gestured for him to sit at the small table. "Take off shirt. I can help with pain." Holt hesitated, unaccustomed to such offers, but the dull throb in his shoulder had been growing worse as storm clouds gathered on the horizon. With a shrug, he unbuttoned his shirt and slipped it off, revealing a torso mapped with scars, testament to a life of violence and hardship. Ayesha's expression didn't change as she approached with a small clay pot of salve. Her fingers were surprisingly gentle as they probed the old wound, identifying the knots of scar tissue beneath the skin. "Wound healed wrong," she commented. "Muscle tied in knots. I can fix some." As she worked the salve into his shoulder with practiced movements, Holt found the pain receding for the first time in years. Her hands moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "You're a healer," he observed. Ayesha nodded. "Medicine woman of Chiricahua, Apache. Was. The emphasis on the past tense didn't escape Holt's notice. What happened? Ayasha's hands paused briefly, then continued their work. I was cast out, left to die as you found me. Your own people did that to you. Holt couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Not my people. One man, Makato. The name came out like a curse. He has power now, whispers poison to elders. Says I cannot bear children, am cursed. Her voice was matter-of-fact, but Holt could hear the pain beneath her stoicism. And they believed him. Some did not. But Makato has many warriors loyal to him. Her fingers pressed deeper into a particularly tight knot, making Holt wince. Sorry. Must hurt to heal. As she shifted position to work on another area, her sleeve rode up, revealing a distinctive tattoo on her forearm, a complex pattern that Holt recognized as the mark of a high-ranking medicine woman of the Chiricahua. At the same moment, Ayasha's gaze fell on Holt's exposed left wrist, where his own tattoo stood out starkly against his tanned skin, the stylized wolf's head. Her hands froze. Mo'i Wijini, she breathed the Apache words coming out in a whisper. Gray wolf. Holt went very still, his muscles tensing beneath her touch. The cabin suddenly seemed too small, the air too thick. You know what this means, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Ayasha stepped back, her eyes now wary. All Apache know this mark. Special soldiers sent to hunt our people. Ghosts who come in night leave only death. Her voice hardened. Butchers! Holt didn't flinch from the accusation. It was nothing he hadn't called himself in the darkest hours of the night. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. Not so long for those who lost families. Ayasha countered her eyes, now studying him with new intensity. Why does Grey Wolf live alone in desert, far from his people? Before Holt could answer, Ayasha's gaze sharpened on a particular scar on his chest, a puckered bullet wound over his heart, partially hidden by graying chest hair. This, she said, reaching out, but stopping just short of touching it. This scar, made by American bullet, not Apache arrow. Holt's jaw tightened. Got shot in the back by my own commander. Left for dead. Why? The question hung in the air between them, simple yet impossibly complex. Because I stopped being a butcher, Holt finally said, his voice rough with old emotion. Because I tried to stop a massacre. Understanding dawned in Ayasha's eyes. Whispering Creek, she said softly. 15 summers ago. Holt's head snapped up, his gray eyes suddenly intense. You know of it. My sister's village, Ayasha said, her voice hollow with old grief. My sister, her husband, their children all murdered. I was away learning medicine in mountains. When I returned, there was only ash and bones. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of shared tragedy viewed from opposite sides of the same horror. The man who shot you, Ayasha said at last. You hunt him now. It wasn't a question, but Holt nodded anyway. Vernon Hargrove. Was tracking him when I found you. Ayasha's expression shifted, something fierce and determined, replacing the wariness in her eyes. I know this name, Hargrove. My brother spoke of him before. She paused. Before Makato turned the tribe against me. Said Hargrove had returned to our lands. Holt leaned forward, suddenly alert. Your brother, who is he? Nakuhei, Ayasha said, a note of pride entering her voice. Chief of our people, or was until recently. The pieces were falling into place now, connections forming that Holt hadn't anticipated. He reached for his shirt, pulling it back on as his mind raced through the implications. Your brother, he said slowly. Would he recognize me? Ayasha studied him, head tilted slightly. He spoke once of a white soldier with sad eyes who tried to save our people, who was shot for his mercy. Her gaze bore into him. Was that you? Holt didn't answer directly. Instead, he rose and moved to the desk, unlocking the drawer with the key around his neck. From it, he withdrew his journal and turned to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Carefully, he extracted a folded piece of paper and handed it to Ayasha. She unfolded it to reveal a crude map of the Arizona Territory with several locations marked in red ink. One was circled repeatedly, a place labeled Whispering Creek. Hargrove didn't lead that massacre because of military orders, Holt said quietly. He had another reason. I've been trying to piece it together for 15 years. Ayasha looked up from the map, her expression grave. And I think I know what it was. She touched a spot on the map near Whispering Creek. Here, sacred place of my people, valley of souls where ancestors rest. Her voice dropped to a near whisper. And where tribal treasures are hidden. Their eyes met across the small cabin, a current of understanding passing between them. Two souls connected by tragedy, now bound by a common enemy. Outside, thunder rumbled as storm clouds gathered over the desert, promising rain to the parched land. But within the cabin, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that would change both their lives forever. The town of Redemption squatted on the edge of the desert, like a tired old dog, its wooden buildings bleached and weathered by years of relentless sun. A single dusty street ran through its center, lined with the usual establishments: saloon, general store, sheriff's office, and a small church whose white paint had long since surrendered to the elements. Holt Morgan rode in alone, leaving Ayasha at the ranch. He'd been reluctant to come at all, but supplies were running low, and Ayasha's wounds needed proper medicine. His saddlebags were empty, and his rifle rested comfortably in its scabbard, within easy reach. As he tied Rusty to the hitching post outside Wilson's general store, he could feel eyes on him, curtains twitching and windows' faces turning to watch his progress. Redemption was small enough that a visitor was noteworthy, especially one as recognizable as Holt Morgan. The bell above the door jangled as he entered the store, a sound at odds with the tense silence that fell upon his arrival. The few customers browsing the shelves found sudden interest in examining goods on the far side of the store, away from the tall gray-haired man with the scout's bearing and the cold eyes. "Well, look what the wind blew in," came a warm, smoky voice from behind the counter. "Thought you might have finally dried up and blown away, Holt Morgan." Ruby Wilson stood with her hands on her ample hips, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to diminish the twinkle in her bright blue eyes. At 68, she was still a handsome woman with laugh lines etched deep around her eyes and mouth. Her husband had been gone for 20 years, but she'd kept his name on the store and his memory in her heart. "Miss Ruby," Holt acknowledged with a slight tip of his hat. "Store's looking good." Ruby snorted. "Flattery'll get you nowhere, old man. What brings you to civilization must be important to drag you away from that hermit shack of yours." Holt placed a list on the counter. "Running low on essentials, and need some medical supplies." Ruby's eyebrows rose as she scanned the list. "Bandages, iodine, laudanum. You planning on getting shot? Or already been just stocking up?" Holt said noncommittally. Ruby studied him over the rim of her spectacles, a knowing look in her eyes. "Uh-huh. And I suppose it has nothing to do with that fancy-dressed group that rode through here 3 days back." Holt's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. "What group would that be?" Ruby began gathering items from his list, moving with the efficiency of someone who knew every inch of their domain. 5 men led by a silver-haired gent with a sheriff's badge and eyes like a rattlesnake. called himself Hargrove. Holt's hand stilled on the counter. He say where they were headed. Ruby shook her head. Didn't say, but they were asking questions about old Apache burial grounds. Seemed mighty interested in local legends. She paused, giving Holt a significant look. Your name came up. How so? Hargrove asked if a former scout named Morgan lived in these parts. Said you were an old friend. Ruby's tone made it clear she hadn't believed that for a second. I told him I hadn't seen hide nor hair of anyone by that name. A muscle worked in Holt's jaw. Appreciate that, Miss Ruby. Don't mention it. She finished assembling his supplies, adding a few items he hadn't requested. On the house, she said when he raised an eyebrow, looking a mite thin even for you. As Ruby tallied his purchases, the store's bell jangled again. Holt didn't turn, but he saw Ruby's expression change, a slight hardening around the eyes, a polite smile that didn't reach them. Mr. Reed, she acknowledged. What can I do for you today? Holt felt the newcomer's presence behind him, a prickling awareness honed by years of survival in hostile territory. Just some tobacco, Mrs. Wilson, came a smooth, cold voice, and perhaps an introduction to your customer. Holt turned slowly, coming face to face with a man in his mid-30s dressed in black, with a pearl-handled revolver prominent on his hip. Preston Reed was lean and handsome in a hard way, with blonde hair and eyes the pale blue of a winter sky. His smile didn't touch those eyes as he extended a hand. Preston Reed, don't believe we've had the pleasure. Holt ignored the outstretched hand. No pleasure in it. Reed's smile widened, taking on a predatory edge. You must be Morgan. Hargrove said we might run into you, said you were tracking him. He made a show of looking around. All by your lonesome, it seems. Just buying supplies, Holt said evenly. Not looking for trouble. Funny thing about trouble, Reed drawled. It has a way of finding certain folks. His gaze flicked to Holt's wrist, where the sleeve of his shirt had risen enough to reveal the edge of his tattoo. Especially folks with certain histories. Ruby cleared her throat. Your goods are ready, Mr. Morgan. That'll be $3.42. Holt placed the money on the counter, his eyes never leaving Reed. Much obliged, Miss Ruby. Reed stepped closer, invading Holt's space with deliberate provocation. Here you've taken up with the local savages, he said, voice pitched low. Harboring a squaw, from what folks are saying. Thought a man with your background would know better. Holt's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his gray eyes. Folks talk too much. Maybe, Reed conceded with a shrug, or maybe Hargrove was right about you going soft. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. Apache whore must be something special to make you forget what her kind did to our boys during the war. Holt's hand moved with the speed that had once made him legendary among scouts, grabbing Reed's collar and shoving him back against a shelf with enough force to rattle the canned goods. The younger man's hand dropped to his gun, but froze when he felt the cold press of steel against his ribs. Holt had drawn a knife no one had seen him carrying. You watch your mouth, boy, Holt said, his voice deadly quiet. And you tell Hargrove when you see him that I haven't forgotten anything. Not one damn thing. The store had gone utterly silent, the few remaining customers frozen in place. Ruby Wilson stood behind the counter, a shotgun now visible in her hands, though whether it was aimed at Reed or Holt was deliberately ambiguous. That's enough, gentlemen, she said firmly. I don't allow bloodshed in my store. Takes too long to clean the floors. Holt held Reed's gaze for a moment longer, then released him and stepped back, the knife disappearing as mysteriously as it had appeared. Reed straightened his collar, a flush of anger coloring his pale cheeks. "You just signed your own death warrant, old man," he said softly. "Hargrove doesn't forgive, and neither do I." "Been dead once already," Holt replied, gathering his purchases. "Didn't take." He tipped his hat to Ruby and strode out of the store, his back straight and his steps unhurried, despite the tension thrumming through him. Reed's eyes followed him, cold with promise. As Holt mounted Rusty and turned toward home, he knew that the confrontation had just accelerated whatever timetable Hargrove was working on. The hunt had changed now. He was both hunter and hunted. The desert stretched before him, shimmering with heat, as the afternoon sun beat down. Somewhere out there, Hargrove was pursuing his old obsession. And waiting at Holt's cabin was a woman whose people had suffered for that obsession. Time was running out for all of them. The rain came that night, a rare blessing in the arid territory. It drummed on the cabin's tin roof, a soothing rhythm that softened the harsh edges of the desert world. Holt sat on the small, covered porch, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette and listening to the water's song. Beside him, Ayesha perched on an upturned crate, her dark eyes reflecting the occasional flash of distant lightning. They had spoken little since his return from town. Holt had relayed what Ruby told him about Hargrove's presence and questions, and Ayesha had listened with grave attention. But as evening fell and the clouds rolled in, a wordless agreement seemed to settle between them, a temporary truce with the urgency of their situation. Now, in the gentle cocoon of rainfall, something shifted in the air between them. Not quite comfort, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. Holt reached into his pocket and withdrew his harmonica, turning it over in his weathered hands. The silver was tarnished in places, worn smooth in others from decades of handling. "Gift from my father," he said unexpectedly, breaking the long silence. "Only thing of his I kept." Ayesha glanced at him, surprised by the voluntary offering of personal information. "He was musician, railroad man," Holt replied, a faint smile touching his lips. "Worked the lines from Kansas to California. Played this every night after supper." His thumb brushed over an engraving on the back. Said music was the only thing that made sense in a senseless world. Without further comment, he raised the harmonica to his lips and began to play a haunting melody that seemed to weave itself into the sound of the falling rain. It spoke of loneliness and longing, of wide-open spaces, and the weight of memory. When the tune ended, silence fell between them again, but it was a different quality of silence, expectant, perhaps, rather than guarded. After a moment, Ayesha began to sing softly in her native tongue. Her voice was low and rich, carrying a melody that seemed ancient as the mountains themselves. Though Holt couldn't understand all the words, he recognized it as a traditional song of her people, one he had heard long ago around different fires. When she finished, she translated without being asked, "Song of Lost Spirits, for those who wander between worlds seeking peace." Holt nodded, understanding all too well. "You sing it well. My grandmother taught me. Said music heals wounds medicine cannot touch." She looked at him directly. "You have many such wounds, I think." Holt's gaze turned toward the rain-shrouded landscape. "More than my share." "The village," Ayesha said quietly. "Whispering Creek. You tried to stop it." For a long moment, Holt didn't answer. When he did, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "Too late, far too late." He drew deeply on his cigarette, the ember glowing bright in the gathering darkness. "By the time I realized what Hargrove intended, the killing had already started. I managed to help a few escape into the hills. Women, children, mostly." "And Hargrove shot you for this?" Holt nodded. "In the back. Left me for the vultures. His hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his chest. Bullet went clean through. Should have killed me. Why didn't it? Holt's eyes took on a faraway look. Apache man found me. Elder, with silver hair. Treated my wounds, gave me water. Never said a word, just helped. Then disappeared. He glanced at Ayasha. Never understood why. Our ways teach that enemies can become allies when the true enemy shows itself, Ayasha said simply. Perhaps he saw in you a warrior with honor, even if misguided. They fell silent again, listening to the rain. After a while, Holt spoke again, his voice so low Ayasha had to strain to hear it. Had a family once, wife Margaret, daughter Hannah. He swallowed hard. Influenza took them 5 years ago, 3 days apart. Ayasha's eyes softened with empathy. This is why you live alone, far from others. Partly, Holt acknowledged. After they died, didn't see much point in being around people. And after hunting Hargrove for so long, he shrugged. Man gets used to solitude. Yet you saved me, Ayasha observed. Brought stranger to your home. Holt had no answer for that. Instead, he played another tune on his harmonica, this one gentler, a lullaby perhaps. When he finished, he found Ayasha watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. What? He asked. Trying to understand white man who risks life for Apache woman, she said. Man with wolf mark who plays healing songs. Holt almost smiled. Told you before. Not common. No, Ayasha agreed. Not common at all. She began to sing again this time, a different song, one with a melody that seemed to complement the tune Holt had just played. As her voice rose and fell with the rhythm of the rain, Holt found himself joining in with his harmonica, the two sounds twining together in unexpected harmony. For that brief moment, as music and rain washed over them, the wounds they both carried seemed to fade just a little, not healed perhaps, but acknowledged and shared, and in that sharing rendered somehow more bearable. The storm continued through the night, cleansing the parched earth and filling the air with the sweet scent of wet sage and desert blossoms. Within the small circle of light on Holt Morgan's porch, two unlikely companions found a moment's peace in a world that had given them precious little of it. Tomorrow would bring its own storms, but for now, this moment was enough. The morning after the rain dawned clear and vibrant, the desert transformed by the rare moisture. Wildflowers that had lain dormant for months erupted in sudden bloom, painting the landscape with splashes of color against the red earth. The air felt cleaner, lighter, carrying the scent of damp soil and new growth. Holt woke early, as was his habit, and found Ayasha already up. She had brewed coffee and was watching the sunrise from the porch, a serene expression on her face that he hadn't seen before. "Dessert blooms," she said, as he joined her, accepting the cup she offered. "Good medicine." Holt nodded, sipping the strong black coffee appreciatively. Ayasha had a way of brewing it that enhanced its flavor without the bitterness he usually accepted as inevitable. "Need to check the herd," he said after a moment. "Rain might have scattered them." Ayasha rose. "I will come. Need herbs that grow after rain." Holt didn't argue. Ayasha had proven herself capable over the past days, her strength returning rapidly. The whip marks on her back were healing cleanly, and she moved with increasing ease. They rode out together, Ayasha mounted on an old paint mare Holt kept as a spare. She rode confidently in the Apache way, minimal tack communicating with the horse through subtle shifts of weight and pressure from her knees. Her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, alert for any sign of danger or opportunity. The small herd of cattle had indeed scattered somewhat during the storm, but not far. As they worked to gather the animals, Holt found himself impressed by Ayasha's skill with horses and her quiet efficiency. They worked well together with minimal need for words. By midday, the herd was secured in a box canyon where the grazing was good, and they turned their attention to Ayasha's herb gathering. She moved purposefully among the suddenly verdant landscape, harvesting specific plants with meticulous care. "This for pain," she explained, showing Holt a small plant with purple flowers. "This for fever. This to stop bleeding." Each went into a different pouch at her waist, her movements practiced and precise. As she worked, she began to share knowledge, pointing out plants that were good for eating, others that were poisonous, still others with specific medicinal properties. Holt listened attentively, recognizing the value of such information in their harsh environment. They had moved about a mile from the ranch, when Rusty suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward in alert attention. Ayasha's mare did the same, both animals staring toward a cluster of rocks in the distance. Holt's hand dropped to his rifle. "Something's out there." Ayasha nodded, her posture shifting subtly to readiness. "Not animal. Too still." They approached cautiously, Holt taking the lead with his rifle ready. As they drew closer, a figure became visible, small, huddled against a boulder, motionless. "Child," Ayasha breathed, spurring her horse forward, before Holt could caution against it. The figure was indeed a child, a boy of perhaps 13, with long black hair and skin bronzed by the sun. He wore the tattered remains of what looked like a school uniform, now dirty and torn beyond recognition. His face was gaunt with hunger, his eyes closed in unconsciousness or exhaustion. Ayasha dismounted swiftly, kneeling beside the boy. Her hands moved with professional efficiency, checking for injuries or signs of illness. "Alive?" she reported, as Holt joined her. "Exhausted, hungry, thirsty." Her fingers probed gently at the boy's scalp, finding a lump and dried blood. "Head hurt, but not bad." As she administered water from her canteen, the boy's eyes fluttered open, dark eyes, in a face that showed clear Apache heritage, though there was something in his features that spoke of mixed blood. When he saw Ayasha, the boy's eyes widened in recognition and fear. He scrambled backward, pressing himself against the boulder, rapid words in Apache tumbling from his lips. Ayasha responded calmly, in the same language, her tone gentle and reassuring. Gradually, the boy's panic subsided, though he still regarded Holt with wary suspicion. "What's he saying?" Holt asked quietly. "His name is Charlie," Ayasha translated. "He run away from school for Indian children. Says bad things happen there." Her expression darkened. "Says they beat children who speak Apache language, cut hair, forbid traditions." Holt's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such schools' government efforts to civilize Native American children by stripping them of their culture and heritage. The methods were often cruel, the results devastating. "Ask him how he got out here," Holt suggested. "We're a long way from any school I know of." Ayasha conversed with the boy again, her expression growing increasingly troubled as he spoke. "He walked," she said finally. 4 days, hiding from searchers." She hesitated. "He is looking for Apache village, his mother's people." "And his father?" "White soldier," Ayasha said, her tone neutral. "Gone now." Charlie was watching their exchange with intelligent eyes, clearly trying to follow the English conversation. Holt crouched down to the boy's level, moving slowly to avoid frightening him. "Charlie," he said, keeping his voice gentle, "we have food water at my ranch. Not far. You can rest there." The boy looked to Ayasha, who nodded encouragingly. After a moment's hesitation, he nodded as well. "Can you ride?" Holt asked, gesturing to the horses. Charlie stood on shaky legs, his pride visibly battling with his exhaustion. "Yes," he said in careful English. "I can ride." They settled the boy on Ayesha's mare, with Ayesha herself riding behind Holt on Rusty. As they made their way back to the ranch, Charlie gradually relaxed enough to share more of his story. He had been at the Indian boarding school for 3 years, ever since his mother died of tuberculosis. His father, a border patrol officer, had abandoned them years earlier. At the school, Charlie had endured beatings, hunger, and constant degradation for any sign of his Apache heritage. But there was something else, something that had triggered his desperate flight. When Ayesha pressed him for details, Charlie's expression grew fearful. "Bad men came to school," he said in halting English, "with guns, looking for Apache children from certain tribes." Holt and Ayesha exchanged a glance of concern. "What men, Charlie?" Holt asked carefully. "Do you remember anything about them?" Charlie nodded solemnly. "Leader was old man with silver hair, badge like star, cold eyes." He shuddered at the memory. "Asked about children from Chiricahua tribe, about families with special knowledge of sacred places." Holt's expression hardened. "Hargrove." Ayesha spoke rapidly to Charlie in Apache, her questions urgent. The boy's responses made her face pale beneath its natural bronze. "Charlie saw Hargrove and men attack Apache trading party," she translated for Holt. "3 days ago, near Canyon of Red Stones. They took elder woman prisoner, killed others." "Elder woman," Holt prompted. Ayesha's eyes were troubled. "From description sounds like Nastya, keeper of stories for our people. She knows all sacred sites, all hidden places." She looked at Holt gravely. "Including Valley of Souls." The implications were clear. Hargrove was getting closer to whatever he sought, and he was willing to kill for it. As the ranch came into view, Holt made a decision. "The boy stays with us," he said firmly, "at least until we figure out what to do next." Ayesha nodded relief evident in her expression. "He is of my people, my responsibility." "Our responsibility," Holt corrected quietly. Ayesha studied him for a moment, then nodded again, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Our responsibility," she agreed. Behind them, Charlie watched their interaction with curious eyes, perhaps sensing the unusual alliance forming between this strange white man and the Apache woman. For the first time in days, the boy felt something like hope. As they approached the cabin, however, Holt's instincts prickled in warning. Something was wrong. His eyes scanned the property, noting subtle signs of disturbance. A bucket moved from its usual place, fresh hoofprints in the mud near the well. "Someone's been here," he said softly, drawing his rifle. "Recently." Ayesha's posture stiffened her hand, moving to the knife at her belt. She spoke quickly to Charlie, who nodded and slid from the horse, taking cover behind a water trough as instructed. Holt dismounted, approaching the cabin with the caution of a seasoned scout. The door stood slightly ajar, though he distinctly remembered closing it firmly before they left. With Ayesha at his back, he pushed it open slowly, rifle ready. The interior was undisturbed at first glance, but Holt's experienced eye caught the subtle signs: a chair not quite where it had been, the desk drawer forced open, its contents rifled through. His journal was gone. "They know," he said grimly. "They know about us, about what we know." Ayesha's expression was equally grave. "Then we must move quickly, before Hargrove finds what he seeks." Charlie appeared in the doorway, his young face solemn with a wisdom beyond his years. In Apache, he said something that made Ayesha's eyes widen. "What did he say?" Holt asked. Ayesha looked at him, her dark eyes intense. "He says he knows where they took Nasha. He followed their tracks before losing strength." Holt's gaze met hers, a silent communication passing between them. The stakes had just risen dramatically. "Then we'd better get ready," he said, checking his rifle. "We've got people to save and a debt to settle." As they prepared for what lay ahead, none of them noticed the small carved symbol freshly etched into the cabin's doorframe, a wolf's head with a line drawn through it, the sign of a death mark. The night wrapped around the small cabin like a shroud broken only by the golden glow of oil lamps and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Charlie had finally fallen asleep after a warm meal, and clean clothes, an old shirt of Holt's that hung on his thin frame like a tent. The boy had curled up on a bedroll near the fireplace, exhaustion finally overcoming his wariness. Holt sat at the table cleaning his rifle with methodical precision, each movement automatic after decades of practice. Across from him, Ayesha sorted through the herbs she had gathered, preparing poultices and medicines with equal care. "The boy needs to go somewhere safe," Holt said quietly, breaking the long silence. "When we go after Hargrove." Ayesha glanced at Charlie's sleeping form. "No safe place for Apache child," she said simply. "Not now. Ruby Wilson might take him. In town. She's got no love for Hargrove or his kind." Ayesha considered this, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps. But first we must know where Hargrove takes Nasha." Charlie said the canyon with stone pillars. "That narrows it down to 2, maybe 3 places." "Needle Canyon," Ayesha confirmed. 3 days' ride south. Ancient place, sacred to my people." She looked up from her work, her dark eyes reflecting the lamplight. "But why does Hargrove want Nasha? Old woman knows many things, but nothing of value to white men." Holt's hands stilled on his rifle. "Unless she knows something about the Valley of Souls." "She is keeper of stories," Ayesha acknowledged, "knows all sacred sites." A shadow crossed her face, "including where ancestors rest and tribal treasures hide." Holt resumed his cleaning, his expression thoughtful. 15 years ago, Hargrove wasn't just following orders at Whispering Creek. He was looking for something valuable enough to massacre an entire village to keep secret. "Gold," Ayesha said with quiet certainty. "White man's eternal hunger." "Maybe," Holt allowed. "But Hargrove never cared much for money itself. Power was always his craving." Charlie stirred in his sleep, murmuring something in Apache. Ayesha moved to the boy's side, smoothing his long hair with a gentle hand, and singing softly until he settled again. When she returned to the table, her expression had changed, more determined, perhaps, or more resolved. "I must know truth, Holt Morgan," she said, her voice low but intense. "About Whispering Creek. About what happened to my sister's village." Holt set down his rifle, his weathered face impassive, though his eyes revealed the conflict within. "You know the truth. I told you." "Not all," Ayesha countered. "You say you tried to stop massacre. But I need to know when, how." She leaned forward. "Need to know if you fired your gun that day." The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Outside, a coyote howled in the distance, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the desolation in Holt's eyes. "While you were gathering herbs today," Ayesha continued when Holt remained silent, "I found hidden pages in your desk, from journal." Holt's head snapped up, his expression hardening. "You went through my things. To survive must know who I trust," Ayesha said unapologetically. "Found pages about Whispering Creek, but they were torn. Incomplete." She held his gaze steadily. "I need to know. For my sister's memory." For a long moment, Holt said nothing. Then, with a weariness that seemed to age him further, he reached into his shirt and withdrew the key that hung around his neck. Rather than opening the desk drawer, however, he moved to a loose floorboard near the hearth carefully prying it up to reveal a small hidden compartment. From it, he extracted a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. His hands were not quite steady as he unwrapped it on the table, revealing a leather-bound book, older and more worn than the journal Ayasha had seen before. "The complete record," he said, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. "Started the day after Whispering Creek. Wrote everything I could remember." Ayasha reached for the book, but stopped when Holt placed his hand on it. "There are things in here," he began, then faltered. "Things I've never told another soul." Ayasha's expression softened slightly. "Secrets are heavy burdens to carry alone." "Some burdens you earn," Holt replied, but he removed his hand, allowing her to take the book. Ayasha opened it carefully, the pages yellowed with age and stained with what might have been water or tears. The handwriting was different from Holt's current script, more jagged, almost frantic in places, as though written by a man on the edge of sanity. As she read, her face remained composed, though her knuckles whitened where she gripped the pages. Holt watched her, his own expression unreadable, a man awaiting judgment. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a complex mixture of emotions, grief, anger, and something else that Holt couldn't identify. "You were there from beginning," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "You helped plan attack." It wasn't a question, but Holt nodded once, accepting the accusation. "Hargrove said it was a raid on a hostile camp, said there were warriors planning attacks on settlements." His voice was hollow. "I believed him, or told myself I did." "But you stopped," Ayasha pressed. "Why, when—" Holt's gaze turned inward, seeing not the cabin, but a day 15 years past, vivid in its horror. "We rode in at dawn. Standard tactic, catch them sleeping, minimizes resistance." His voice had taken on a detached quality, as though reciting a report. "First sign something was wrong was the lack of warriors. Women, children, old ones. No fighting men." He swallowed hard. "Hargrove didn't care. Ordered us to fire anyway. Said orders were to eliminate the entire camp." "And you obeyed," Ayasha said, her tone flat. Holt's eyes met hers, unflinching in his admission. "At first, God help me, at first I did." His hands clenched on the table. "Until I saw a child. Girl, maybe 4 years old, standing in front of a burning wickiup, clutching a doll." His voice cracked. "She looked like my Hannah." Ayasha's expression remained impassive, though something flickered in her eyes. "What did you do?" "Grabbed her, tried to get her to safety." Holt's voice dropped to a whisper. "Too late. Stray bullet hit her. Died in my arms." The cabin fell silent except for the crackle of the fire and Charlie's soft breathing. Ayasha sat motionless, absorbing the weight of Holt's confession. "After that," Holt continued after a moment, "something broke in me. Couldn't do it anymore. Started helping people escape instead. Got a few to the hills before Hargrove noticed." His hand moved unconsciously to the scar on his chest. "Shot me himself when he caught me leading a group of women and children out." "And the girl?" Ayasha asked quietly. "The one who died." Holt's eyes closed briefly, pain etching deeper lines into his weathered face. "Her name was Kimi. I learned later she was the chief's youngest daughter." Ayasha went very still. "Kimi." She repeated the name, clearly meaningful to her. "Small one, with sunshine laugh." Holt looked up sharply. "You knew her. My sister's youngest." Ayasha said, her voice suddenly thick with emotion. "My niece." The revelation hung in the air between them, a connection neither had anticipated, the final piece of a tragic puzzle falling into place. Holt's face drained of color, the implications of her words hitting him like a physical blow. "The village," he said slowly. "Whispering Creek. It was your sister's village." Ayesha nodded, once her composure finally cracking to reveal the raw grief beneath. "I was in mountains training as medicine woman. When I returned, there was nothing. Only ashes and bones." Her voice hardened. "And stories of gray wolves who came with fire and death." The weight of this shared history settled around them, heavy as a burial shroud. For a long moment neither spoke. "I have hunted Hargrove for 15 years, Holt finally said, his voice low and intense. "Not just for justice, for atonement." He met Ayesha's gaze directly. "I cannot bring back your sister or Kimmy, cannot undo what I was part of, but I swear to you, Hargrove will answer for what he did." Ayesha studied him, her expression unreadable. "Atonement does not come from more killing." "No," Holt agreed, "but justice might." "Justice." Ayesha echoed the word, sounding foreign on her tongue. "My people have never known white man's justice." "Not talking about white man's justice," Holt replied. "Talking about the only kind that matters out here, the kind you make yourself." Ayesha's gaze dropped to the journal, her fingers tracing over a crude drawing Holt had made a map of Whispering Creek, with X marks indicating where bodies had fallen. So many marks. "There is something else," she said after a long silence. "Something you have not told me." But Holt waited, sensing she had more to say. "This journal speaks of tribal treasure Hargrove sought," she continued. "What was it?" "Don't know exactly," Holt admitted. "Hargrove kept that close, but after the massacre, while I was bleeding out, I saw him take something from the chief's wickiup. Something small, wrapped in leather." He shook his head. "Never knew what it was." "I do," Ayesha said, her voice suddenly certain. "Map to Valley of Souls. Sacred map passed down through generations of chiefs." Her eyes met his. "Map only chief's family could read." The pieces clicked into place in Holt's mind. That's why he's been searching all these years. He has the map, but can't read it. "And now he has Nasha," Ayesha added grimly. "Who knows all stories, all symbols." "He'll force her to translate it," Holt concluded, "and then he'll have no further use for her." The implications hung in the air between them, the urgency of their situation suddenly magnified. Lives depended on their next actions. Ayesha closed the journal, her decision apparently made. "We leave at dawn," she said firmly, "to save Nasha and stop Hargrove." "After what I've told you," Holt said carefully, "you still want to ride with me?" Ayesha's dark eyes met his, filled with a complex mixture of emotions, grief, anger, determination, and something else that might have been understanding. "Man who wrote this," she said, touching the journal, "is not same man who sits before me now." She nodded toward Charlie sleeping peacefully by the fire. "Man who saves Apache child, who tends Apache woman's wounds, who plays healing songs in the rain, this man I will ride with." The absolution was not complete. Perhaps it never could be, but it was enough for the moment. Enough to forge an alliance, born of shared pain and common purpose. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the small dramas of human existence. But within the cabin, something had shifted, a burden shared, if not lifted, and a path forward illuminated by the harsh light of truth. Dawn broke over the desert in ribbons of gold and crimson, painting the landscape in fire. Holt stood on the porch, watching the light creep across the land, a cup of coffee cooling in his weathered hands. Behind him, the cabin door opened, and Ayesha emerged, dressed for travel in a mixture of her traditional clothing and items borrowed from Holt's sparse wardrobe. "Charlie still sleeping?" Holt asked without turning. "Yes," Ayesha confirmed. Boy needs rest. Holt nodded, taking a final sip of his coffee before setting the cup aside. Been thinking about Ruby Wilson, he said. Still believe she's our best option for Charlie. She's tough, fair-minded, won't let anyone harm him. If she agrees, Ayesha pointed out. She'll agree. Holt's tone suggested this wasn't merely hope. Ruby lost a son in the Apache Wars. Guilt's a powerful motivator. Ayesha considered this, then nodded. When do we leave? Soon as the boy wakes. Need to be in town and back before midday. Holt glanced at the horizon. Figure we'll reach Needle Canyon by tomorrow night if we push hard. Hargrove will have men watching, Ayesha warned. Scouts, guards. Counting on it, Holt replied with grim satisfaction. Been tracking Hargrove too long not to know his habits. He's predictable in his caution. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching a single rider coming fast across the open ground. Holt's hand dropped to his holstered revolver, while Ayesha melted back into the shadows of the porch. The rider materialized out of the morning haze, a young man on a lathered horse pushing the animal hard. As he drew closer, Holt recognized him as one of the cowhands from a neighboring ranch, a boy of perhaps 18 named Jimmy Reeves. "Mr. Morgan," the young man called as he reined in his mount. "Got a message for you, sir." Holt stepped off the porch, his posture relaxed but alert. "Bit early for social calls, Jimmy." The young cowhand was breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion and what looked like fear. "Not social, sir. Warning." He glanced nervously at Ayesha, who had emerged from the shadows. "Reed's gathering men in town, saying you're harboring renegade Apaches, that you've gone native." "That's so." Holt's voice was mild, though his eyes had hardened. "And folks are believing him." Jimmy shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Some are. Others remember you from before, know you ain't the kind to turn traitor." He hesitated. "But Reed's got 10, maybe 12 men with him. All armed. All been drinking since last night." "A lynching party," Holt said flatly. Jimmy nodded miserably. "Heard 'em talking about riding out here at noon. Thought you ought to know." "Appreciate the warning, son." Holt reached into his pocket and extracted a silver dollar, flipping it to the young man. "For your trouble." Jimmy caught the coin, but looked uncomfortable. "Didn't do it for money, Mr. Morgan. Pa says we owe you from that time you helped with the rustlers." Holt nodded acknowledgement. "Your pa's a good man. Tell him we're square now." The young cowhand hesitated clearly, struggling with something. "There's more," he finally said. "Reed's not just talking about you. He's saying there's a bounty on any Apache found off the reservation, dead or alive." Ayesha's expression didn't change, but Holt noticed her hand tighten on the knife at her belt. "Bounty from who?" Holt asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. "New sheriff," Jimmy replied. "Silver-haired fella, name of Hargrove." Holt and Ayesha exchanged a look of grim confirmation. "Jimmy," Holt said, his tone shifting to one of quiet authority, "you go home now. Forget you came here. If anyone asks, you haven't seen me in weeks." The young man nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Yes, sir." He gathered his reins, preparing to depart, then paused. "Mr. Morgan Pa also said to tell you there's others who don't hold with Reed's ways. Said if you need help, there's those who'll stand with you." With that, he wheeled his horse and galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. "Hargrove moves faster than expected," Ayesha observed as they watched the rider disappear into the distance. "He's cutting off our options," Holt agreed, "making sure we can't get help from town." The cabin door creaked, and Charlie appeared, rubbing sleep from his eyes. The boy had clearly overheard at least part of the conversation, for his young face was grave beyond his years. "Bad men coming," he asked in his careful English. Holt exchanged a glance with Ayesha, who nodded slightly in agreement that honesty was the best course. Yes, Holt told the boy, which means our plans have changed. He turned to Ayesha. We can't take Charlie to town now. Too dangerous. But we cannot take him to Needle Canyon, Ayesha countered. Too dangerous also. Charlie straightened his thin shoulders, squaring with pride. I can help, he insisted. I know desert, know how to hide, how to track. Holt studied the boy thoughtfully. There was strength in the child's bearing, a resilience born of hardship, but he was still just a boy. What about the mission caves? Holt suggested after a moment. Old Padre Joaquin might take him in. Ayesha considered this, then nodded slowly. Mission is neutral ground. Apache respect, old Padre. It's settled then, Holt said with finality. We leave now, all of us. Head south toward the mission, then Ayesha and I continue to Needle Canyon once Charlie's safe. They moved with the efficiency of those accustomed to sudden departures, gathering only what was essential weapons, water provisions for 3 days' hard riding. Holt retrieved his journal from its hiding place, tucking it securely inside his saddlebag. As Ayesha helped Charlie prepare, Holt took a final walk through the cabin that had been his home for 5 years. His gaze lingered on the photograph of Margaret and Hannah, their smiling faces frozen in time. Won't be long now, he murmured to the image. One way or another. He tucked the photograph into his shirt pocket close to his heart, then stepped outside to where Ayesha and Charlie waited with the horses. Without a backward glance, he mounted Rusty and led them away from the ranch, riding south toward the distant mountains where the old Spanish mission stood. They had been traveling for perhaps an hour, when Ayesha, riding slightly ahead, suddenly reined in her mare. Her posture was alert, head tilted as though listening to something beyond human hearing. Riders, she said tersely, coming fast, from east. Holt scanned the horizon, seeing nothing but feeling no inclination to doubt Ayesha's senses. How many? 3, maybe 4, she replied, sliding from her horse with fluid grace. She pressed her ear to the ground, an ancient technique that Holt had seen Apache scouts use during the war. 4 men, heavy horses, armed. Reed's scouts, Holt concluded grimly. He's not waiting for noon. They were in exposed territory, a flat stretch of desert with minimal cover. The nearest shelter was a rocky outcropping perhaps half a mile ahead, but reaching it before the riders spotted them would be impossible. We need a diversion, Holt decided. Charlie, you come with me. Ayesha, take my horse and ride for those rocks. We'll circle around and meet you there. Ayesha's expression was skeptical. Why split up? Because my horse leaves deeper tracks easier to follow, Holt explained. You lead them away while Charlie and I go cross-country on foot. Apache style. He nodded to the boy. Charlie knows how to move without leaving sign, don't you, son? The boy nodded solemnly, pride evident in his posture at being acknowledged for his skills. Ayesha still looked unconvinced. Dangerous for you and boy. More dangerous if Reed's men catch all 3 of us in the open, Holt countered. Trust me, Ayesha. I wasn't just any scout during the war. I was the best. Something in his tone must have convinced her, for she nodded sharply and mounted Rusty. 2 hours, she said. If you are not at rocks by then, we'll be there, Holt assured her. Now go. Ayesha spurred Rusty into a gallop, heading directly for the rocky outcropping. Her own mare, with no rider, followed naturally, both horses kicking up a visible dust cloud. Come on, Charlie, Holt said, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Time to show me how good you really are at disappearing. A small, fierce smile crossed the boy's face, the first Holt had seen from him. Without a word, Charlie led the way into a dry wash that cut across the desert floor. His movements suddenly transformed from those of a half-starved boarding school escapee to a young Apache warrior at home in the harsh landscape. Holt followed, impressed despite himself at the boy's natural skill. Charlie moved like a shadow, leaving minimal trace of his passage, instinctively choosing the hardest ground where footprints wouldn't show. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, using the wash as cover until it veered away from their destination. When they emerged, Holt could see the rocky outcropping in the distance and the dust cloud of riders approaching it from the east. 4 men, Charlie confirmed in a whisper, his keen eyes catching details Holt's older vision missed. With guns, Holt nodded, studying the terrain between their position and the rocks. It was exposed, but there was a slight depression that might provide some cover if they crawled. "Down," he instructed Charlie, dropping to his belly. "Like hunting rabbits. Slow and steady." The boy complied without question, and they began the painstaking process of crossing the open ground without being seen. The sun beat down mercilessly, the ground hot enough to burn through their clothing. Sweat soaked Holt's shirt, and his old bones protested the unaccustomed posture, but he pushed on, unwilling to show weakness before the stoic child beside him. They were perhaps 100 yards from the rocks when a shot rang out, followed by the distant sound of shouting. Holt froze, straining to see what was happening. At the base of the outcropping, 4 mounted men had surrounded a figure on horseback, Ayasha on Rusty. She sat tall in the saddle, facing the men with apparent calm, though Holt could see the tension in her posture even at this distance. "Can you hear what they're saying?" he asked Charlie, whose young ears might catch what his could not. The boy lifted his head slightly, listening intently. "Men say, she Apache witch. Say there is money for her head." His young face darkened with anger. "Say they will have fun with her first." Holt's jaw tightened, his hand moving to the revolver on his hip. "Stay here," he told Charlie. "If anything happens to me, you run for the mission. Don't stop for anything." Charlie's eyes widened in alarm. "What'd you do?" But Holt was already rising to a crouch, checking his weapon with practiced efficiency. "Creating a diversion," he said grimly. "When I start shooting you, stay down. Count to 50, then make for those rocks. Ayasha will find you." Before the boy could protest, Holt was moving not toward the confrontation directly, but in a flanking maneuver that would bring him to a position behind Reed's men. Despite his age, he moved with the stealth and purpose of the veteran scout. He had once been using every scrap of cover the barren landscape provided. As he drew closer, he could hear Reed's voice, arrogant and cruel. "Worth twice as much alive, but I ain't particular," the gunman was saying. "Hargrove just wants proof you're dead. Said something about you knowing too much about some valley." Ayasha's reply was too low for Holt to catch, but whatever she said made Reed laugh, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "Brave talk for a squaw surrounded by 4 guns, Reed said. "Let's see how brave you are when—" The crack of Holt's revolver cut him off mid-sentence. Holt had chosen his position carefully, placing his first shot to maximum effect, not to kill but to create confusion. The bullet struck the canteen hanging from Reed's saddle, exploding it in a spray of water that startled his horse into rearing. In the ensuing chaos, Holt fired twice more, one shot, taking the hat off another rider, the second striking a saddle horn. His fourth shot was more deliberate, catching a third man in the shoulder and spinning him from his horse. Reed had recovered quickly, wheeling his mount and returning fire in Holt's general direction. But Holt was already moving, using the confusion to change position while shouting at the top of his lungs. "That's 1 down, Reed. Want to try for 2? His voice echoed off the rocks, making it difficult to pinpoint his location. Reed and his remaining men fired wildly, their shots kicking up dust but finding no target. Ayasha seized the opportunity, spurring Rusty directly at the nearest rider. The big horse slammed into the smaller mount, sending both horse and rider tumbling. In one fluid motion, Ayasha leapt from Rusty's back onto the fallen man, the knife in her hand flashing in the sunlight. Holt couldn't see what happened next, as he was forced to duck behind a boulder to avoid Reed's increasingly accurate fire. When he peered out again, Ayasha was mounted once more, charging toward Reed himself, with a bone-chilling Apache war cry. Reed turned to meet the threat, raising his pistol, only to have it shot from his hand by Holt's fifth bullet. The gunman howled in pain, clutching his bleeding fingers. The last unwounded rider, seeing the tide of battle turn decisively against them, spurred his horse and fled, abandoning his companions without hesitation. Reed, finding himself suddenly alone and disarmed, with Ayasha bearing down on him from one side and Holt emerging from cover on the other, made the prudent choice. He wheeled his horse and galloped after his fleeing companion, leaving two men behind, one unconscious, one wounded and moaning. Holt approached cautiously, his revolver trained on the wounded man. Ayasha dismounted beside the unconscious rider, checking him with clinical detachment. "Alive," she reported. "Head hit rock when he fell." "This one's alive too," Holt confirmed, nudging the wounded man with his boot. Bullet went clean through his shoulder. A small figure darted from behind a distant rock, running toward them with surprising speed. Charlie's face was alight with a fierce joy as he reached them. "You fought like great warrior," he told Holt, admiration evident in his voice. Then, turning to Ayasha with equal enthusiasm, "And you like mountain lion." Despite the gravity of their situation, Holt found himself smiling at the boy's excitement. "Easy, son. Battle's not something to celebrate." "What do we do with them?" Ayasha asked, nodding toward the two fallen men. Holt considered the options. Leaving them might mean their deaths in the desert heat. Taking them along was impractical. Killing them in cold blood was unthinkable. "We'll take their guns and horses," he decided. "Leave them water and shade. Their friends will come back for them once they realize we're not following." Ayasha nodded approval of this middle path. As they disarmed the men and arranged them in the shade of the largest boulder, the wounded one regained enough composure to speak. "Morgan," he gasped, recognizing Holt. "You're a dead man. Reed won't forget this. Neither will Hargrove." "Hargrove's memory isn't my concern," Holt replied evenly. "Tell Reed if he's smart, he'll ride for California and not look back. Hargrove's not the kind of man who tolerates failure." Leaving the men with a single canteen of water, Holt, Ayasha, and Charlie mounted up now with spare horses and additional weapons. They rode south at a steady pace, the mission still their immediate destination. As they traveled, Charlie's initial excitement faded, replaced by a more thoughtful demeanor. He rode beside Ayasha, occasionally asking her questions in Apache about her healing practices or tribal customs. To Holt's surprise, the boy also directed questions to him about tracking about the desert, about survival. By mid-afternoon, they had put significant distance between themselves and the site of the confrontation. They paused in the shade of a small grove of cottonwoods beside a nearly dry creek bed, allowing the horses to rest and drink from the shallow pools that remained. As Ayasha tended to a scrape Charlie had acquired during their crawl across the desert, Holt kept watch, his experienced eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Finding none, he allowed himself to relax marginally, sipping water from his canteen as he considered their next moves. "Why do you help us?" Charlie asked suddenly, the question directed at Holt with a child's directness. "White men not help Apache, not ever." Holt regarded the boy thoughtfully. "Not all white men are the same," he said finally. "Just like not all Apache are the same." Charlie digested this, his young face serious. "You were soldier," he observed, "fought against Apache." "I was," Holt acknowledged. "Did things I'm not proud of." "Then why help now?" It was a fair question, one that Holt had asked himself many times over the past days. The answer, when it came, surprised him with its simplicity and truth. "Because it's right," he said, "and because I've done enough wrong in my life." Charlie nodded, apparently satisfied with this response. He turned to Ayasha, asking her something in Apache that Holt couldn't follow. Whatever she answered made the boy's eyes widen in surprise before he looked back at Holt with new respect. "What did you tell him?" Holt asked Ayasha when Charlie had moved away to check on the horses. "Truth," she replied simply. "That you try to make right what once was wrong. That you saved my life when you could have left me to die." She met his gaze steadily. "That path of healing sometimes begins with blood on hands." Holt absorbed this, touched more deeply than he cared to admit by her understanding. Wise words for a young woman. A rare smile touched Ayasha's lips. "Medicine woman learns wisdom early, or patients die." The smile faded. "My grandmother was healer before me. Said always, hardest wounds to heal are those we cannot see." Holt nodded, thinking of the scars they both carried, visible and invisible. Before he could respond, Charlie returned his posture, suddenly alert. "Riders," the boy said quietly. "Many, coming from north." Holt was on his feet, instantly moving to higher ground for a better view. In the distance, a dust cloud was visible, too large for a small group, too orderly for a cattle drive. "How many you make it?" he asked Ayasha, who had joined him. She studied the approaching cloud, her keen eyes narrowed against the sun. 15, maybe 20, she estimated. Moving fast. "Reed found reinforcements," Holt concluded grimly. "We need to move. Now." They broke camp with practiced efficiency, mounted quickly, and continued south at an increased pace. The mission was still hours away, too far to reach, before the pursuing riders overtook them. "Need to find defensible position," Ayasha said, echoing Holt's thoughts. "Place to make stand." Holt nodded, his mind racing through options. The terrain ahead was increasingly broken, small canyons and arroyos cutting through the landscape as they approached the foothills. If they could reach one of the narrower passages, they might be able to hold off a larger force. "There," Charlie said, suddenly pointing to a formation of red rocks jutting from the desert floor perhaps a mile ahead. "Good place. Has water, has caves." Holt glanced at Ayasha, who nodded confirmation. "Boy is right. Ancient place. My people used as shelter for generations." "Lead the way," Holt told Charlie, impressed once again by the child's knowledge and resourcefulness. As they rode toward the red rocks, Holt couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns his life had taken. A week ago, he had been a solitary man consumed by a 15-year quest for vengeance. Now he rode with an Apache medicine woman and a half-Apache boy, fleeing from the very man he had spent years hunting. The irony wasn't lost on him, but neither was the sense that somehow in this unlikely alliance he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing. Purpose. Connection. Perhaps even a kind of redemption. Behind them, the dust cloud grew larger, the pursuing riders gaining ground with every passing minute. Ahead, the red rocks loomed, offering shelter and the possibility of survival. Between the three figures rode hard under the merciless desert sun, bound together by circumstance and choice. An old scout seeking atonement, a healer seeking justice, and a child seeking belonging. An unlikely alliance forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual need. Whether it would be enough to save them remained to be seen. The red rock formation rose from the desert floor like the spine of some ancient beast, its weathered surfaces glowing crimson in the late afternoon sun. As they drew closer, Holt could see why Charlie had chosen it. The formation was a natural fortress with narrow approaches and multiple levels that would give defenders a significant advantage. They reached the rocks just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the pursuing riders still distant, but steadily gaining ground. Charlie led them confidently through a narrow passage between towering stone walls, the path twisting and turning until it opened into a small, hidden canyon. Holt drew up in surprise at the sight that greeted them. The canyon was a hidden oasis. A small spring bubbled from the base of the far wall, creating a shallow pool before disappearing underground again. Stunted cottonwoods and desert willows provided patches of shade, while the canyon walls themselves were honeycombed with small caves and shelters. Most surprising of all were the ancient pictographs adorning the stone walls, stylized figures of animals and humans, spirals, and geometric patterns painted in fading red and yellow ochre. "Sacred place," Ayasha explained, noting Holt's reaction. "Birthing place of my tribe many generations ago." "Will others know of it?" Holt asked, practical concerns foremost in his mind, despite the wonder of the place. Ayasha shook her head. "Few remember old ways, old places. Younger Apache forced to reservations, old knowledge fading." A shadow crossed her face. "This why Makato was able to turn tribe against me. Few elders remain who remember true traditions." They dismounted quickly, leading the horses to the pool to drink. While Ayasha and Charlie saw to the animals, Holt made a rapid assessment of their defensive options. The single entrance to the canyon was the obvious choke point, but there were also positions higher in the rocks that would provide excellent firing platforms. "Charlie," he called, "how many ways in and out of this place?" The boy pointed to the entrance they had used then, to a narrow crevice in the far wall. "Two ways, main path and secret path. Secret path, hard to find, hard to use. Goes up over ridge." Holt nodded, already formulating a plan. "Good. We'll hold them at the main entrance as long as possible. If they break through, we retreat up to those caves and keep them pinned down until dark. Then we use the secret path to slip away." "And if they post guards outside both paths?" Ayasha asked practically. "Then we're in for a long siege," Holt admitted. "But Reed's not the patient type. He'll try a frontal assault first." They worked quickly to prepare their defenses, gathering loose rocks to create crude but effective barricades near the entrance. Holt distributed the weapons they had taken from Reed's men, ensuring each of them was well armed. Even Charlie was given a revolver despite Holt's initial reluctance. The boy handled the weapon with surprising familiarity, checking the cylinder and action with practiced movements. "School guard let me clean guns sometimes," he explained when Holt raised an eyebrow. "Taught me how they work." As the sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the canyon, they took their positions. Holt behind a barricade directly facing the entrance, Ayasha higher up with a rifle, and Charlie stationed as a lookout near the secret path, ready to report any attempt to flank them. The waiting was always the hardest part. Holt felt the familiar tightening in his gut that preceded combat, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years, but had never forgotten. Beside him, Rusty stamped restlessly, sensing the tension in the air. "Easy, old boy," Holt murmured, patting the horse's neck. "Won't be long now." As if on cue, a voice echoed from outside the canyon entrance, Preston Reed's distinctive drawl amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls. "Morgan, I know you're in there. Come out now, bring the squaw and the boy, and maybe you'll live to see sunset." Holt exchanged a glance with Ayasha, who had moved silently to his side. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, a clear rejection of surrender. "Not interested in your offers, Reed," Holt called back. Why don't you and your boys ride on back to town live to fight another day?" Reed's laugh echoed off the canyon walls, an ugly sound devoid of humor. "No can do, old man Sheriff Hargroves put a price on your head. $500 dead or alive." "Must be getting desperate if he's offering that much," Holt commented to Ayasha in a lower voice. To Reed he called, "What's Hargrove so afraid of, Reed? What's he think I know?" There was a pause before Reed responded, suggesting Holt's question had struck a nerve. "Don't matter what you know. What matters is you're harboring Apache fugitives and interfering with legal business." "Legal business?" Holt scoffed loudly. "Is that what you call kidnapping an old woman and massacring her people?" Another pause longer this time. When Reed spoke again, his voice had lost some of its swagger. "Don't know what you're talking about, Morgan. I'm talking about Nastya Reed, the storyteller Hargrove took from the trading party, the one he needs to find the Valley of Souls." The silence that followed was profound. Holt could almost picture Reed's face, the calculations going on behind those cold blue eyes. When the gunman finally spoke again, his voice was lower, more menacing. "You know too much, Morgan. Which means you really can't leave this canyon alive." The next sound was a rifle shot, the bullet whining off the rocks near Holt's position. He ducked instinctively, pulling Ayasha down with him. "So much for negotiation," he muttered. Ayasha's expression was grim. "They will rush entrance soon. Too many for us to hold back." Holt knew she was right. With at least 15 men, Reed could afford to sacrifice a few in a frontal assault, overwhelming their position through sheer numbers. "We need a diversion," he said, thinking rapidly. "Something to split their forces or draw them away." Before Ayasha could respond, a commotion erupted outside the canyon, shouts of alarm, the sounds of horses whinnying in panic, and a series of gunshots that didn't seem directed at their position. "What the hell?" Holt muttered, risking a peek over the barricade. Through the narrow canyon entrance, he could see Reed's men in disarray, their attention directed away from the canyon. Several horses had broken free and were galloping away across the desert, while the men themselves were firing at something Holt couldn't see. Charlie appeared beside them, his young face alight with excitement. "Apache," he whispered urgently. "Apache warriors attack bad men." Holt and Ayasha exchanged a startled glance before both moved to better vantage points. From higher up, they could see the cause of the commotion. A small group of mounted Apache warriors, perhaps 6 or 7, had descended on Reed's men from the surrounding hills. Their attack was not a frontal assault, but a classic hit-and-run tactic designed to create maximum confusion. "Who are they?" Holt asked, turning to Ayasha. "Friends of yours?" Ayasha's face showed genuine surprise. "Not know them," she admitted. "But they wear markings of Chiricahua Band, my people." As they watched, the Apache riders broke off their attack as suddenly as they had begun it, vanishing into the gathering dusk, with the skill born of generations of desert warfare. Reed's men, their numbers reduced and their horses scattered, fell back to a defensive position some distance from the canyon entrance. "That buys us some time," Holt observed, "but they'll regroup soon enough." "We should go now," Ayasha urged, "while they are disorganized." Holt hesitated, reluctant to abandon their defensible position, yet knowing she was right. "The mission's still too far to reach before dark," he pointed out. "We'd be exposed on open ground." "So there is another place," Charlie interjected. "Not far. Old trading post. Empty now, but strong walls." Holt knew the place. The boy meant an abandoned stagecoach station that had been converted to a trading post before being abandoned during the last Apache uprising. It was perhaps 3 miles south, a defensible structure with thick adobe walls. Might work, he conceded. But we'd need to be damn sure Reed's men don't follow. I can make sure, Charlie said with surprising confidence. Know how to hide trail. Holt looked at the boy with new respect. All right, we'll try it. But we move fast and quiet. They gathered their remaining supplies and weapons, leaving behind anything not essential for immediate survival. Using the secret path Charlie had identified, they led their horses up through a narrow crevice that wound its way to the top of the ridge overlooking the canyon. From this vantage point, they could see Reed's men regrouping near a small fire, their numbers noticeably reduced. Several bodies lay motionless on the ground, evidence of the Apache raiders' effectiveness. They took heavy losses, Holt observed. Reed won't be happy about that. Good, Ayasha said, simply, no trace of sympathy in her voice. They descended the far side of the ridge with painstaking care, Charlie leading the way, with the sureness of one who had traveled these paths before. The boy was proving himself remarkably capable, his knowledge of the terrain and Apache ways invaluable. As darkness fell in earnest, they mounted up and headed south. Charlie periodically dropping back to obscure their trail using techniques that impressed even Holt, who had learned tracking from the best scouts in the army. They reached the abandoned trading post just as the moon rose a silver disk that bathed the desert in ghostly light. The building stood alone on a small rise, its adobe walls pale in the moonlight. The wooden roof had partially collapsed, but the walls themselves were intact, 2 feet thick and solid as the day they were built. After ensuring the building was truly abandoned, they led the horses into what had once been a corral attached to the main structure. Inside, the trading post consisted of a single large room with a massive fireplace at one end and small windows set high in the walls, defensible if it came to that. Charlie, keep watch, Holt instructed as they settled in. Ayasha and I need to talk. The boy nodded and took up position near one of the windows, his young face solemn with responsibility. Holt and Ayasha moved to the far corner of the room, speaking in low voices to avoid being overheard. Those Apache warriors, Holt began. You really don't know them. Ayasha shook her head. Not personally, but markings were clear. Chiricahua band that follows Chief Nakohe. She hesitated. My brother. You think they came looking for you? Perhaps, she acknowledged. Or perhaps they track Hargrove also. If Nasha was taken, my brother would send warriors to find her. Holt considered this new information. If your brother's warriors are also hunting Hargrove, we might be able to join forces. Not simple, Ayasha cautioned. My brother may not know of Makato's betrayal, may still believe lies told about me. But he's your brother, Holt pointed out. Surely he'd listen to your side. Ayasha's expression grew troubled. Brothers can turn against sisters when power is at stake. Nakohe is great chief, but Makato has poisoned many minds. Holt fell silent, recognizing the complexity of tribal politics was beyond his understanding. After a moment, he changed tack. What's in this valley of souls that's worth killing for just treasure? Not just treasure, Ayasha replied, her voice dropping even lower. Valley is sacred burial place of chiefs and medicine people, contains bones of ancestors, sacred objects, tribal history. Her eyes met his. And yes, treasure too. Gold and silver given by Spanish long ago hidden from those who would steal it. That explains Hargrove's interest, Holt mused. But there's something else going on here. Something bigger. Before Ayasha could respond, Charlie's urgent whisper cut through the darkness. Someone comes single rider from east. Holt moved swiftly to the window, Ayasha close behind. In the moonlight, they could see a lone figure approaching on horseback, moving slowly, almost casually, as though unconcerned about being detected. "Not Reed," Holt observed, noting the rider's silhouette. "Smaller. Might be a scout." "No," Ayasha said, her voice suddenly tense. "Is Apache riding style." As the rider drew closer, Charlie gasped in recognition. "Is Kime," he exclaimed in a fierce whisper. "Ayasha's uncle." Ayasha's face showed surprise and caution in equal measure. "Kime was friend once," she said to Holt, "but allegiances may have changed." "Only one way to find out," Holt decided, moving toward the door. "I'll go out and meet him. You two stay inside, ready to run if things go bad." "No," Ayasha countered firmly. "I will go. Is my uncle my responsibility?" Holt wanted to argue, but recognized the determination in her stance. "All right," he conceded. "But I'll cover you from here." Ayasha nodded and slipped outside, moving to stand in the open area before the trading post. The approaching rider, now clearly visible as an older Apache man with silver streaks in his long hair, reined in his horse about 20 yards away. For a long moment, neither spoke, each assessing the other in the silvery moonlight. Then the older man raised his hand in greeting, speaking in Apache too softly for Holt to hear. Ayasha responded in the same language, her posture remaining wary but not hostile. The conversation continued for several minutes, both speaking with increasing animation. Finally, Ayasha turned and gestured toward the trading post. "Holt," she called, "is safe. Kime comes as friend." Holt emerged cautiously, rifle in hand, but pointed at the ground. The older Apache regarded him with keen, intelligent eyes, set in a face weathered by decades of desert living. "So," Kame said in surprisingly good English, "you are the gray wolf who helps my niece." His tone made it unclear whether this was a compliment or an accusation. "Former gray wolf," Holt corrected. "Now, just a man trying to right some wrongs." Kame studied him with unnerving intensity before nodding once, apparently satisfied with what he saw. "We have common enemy," he stated. "Vernon Hargrove." "Seems that way," Holt agreed. "Your men attacked Reed's party earlier." "Yes," Kime confirmed without elaboration. "Hargrove takes Nasha. This cannot stand." "Where is Hargrove now?" Holt asked, getting to the point. Kime's expression grew grave. "Needle Canyon, with many men, many guns." He looked at Ayasha. "They force Nasha to reveal sacred knowledge. She resists, but is old, cannot resist forever." "And my brother?" Ayasha asked. "Nakohe, where is he?" A shadow passed over Kime's face. "Dead," he said flatly. "Killed by Makato 3 moons ago. Makato now calls himself Chief Rules, with fear." Ayasha's face showed shock and grief, her composure cracking for the first time since Holt had known her. "Nakohe. Dead. My brother." Kame nodded grimly. "Makato said was accident during hunt, but many suspect truth." His eyes hardened. "Makato now allies with Hargrove, betrays sacred places for weapons, whiskey power." The pieces were falling into place now, the full scope of what they were facing becoming clear. Holt turned to Ayasha, whose face had transformed from grief to a cold, hard fury. "I must go to Needle Canyon," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotion in her eyes. "Must stop this desecration." "We will go," Holt corrected quietly. "Together." Kime watched this exchange with interest. "I have 6 warriors," he offered. "Good fighters loyal to old ways. We join you." Holt considered the proposition. 7 Apache warriors, plus himself, Ayasha, and Charlie, against Hargrove's men and Makato's followers. Still poor odds, but better than they had been an hour ago. When? He asked simply. Now, Kami replied. Hargrove moves fast. By dawn, may be too late. Holt glanced at Ayasha, who nodded her agreement, despite her evident grief. The boy stays here, Holt stipulated. Too dangerous. To his surprise, it was Kime who objected. Boy must come, the older man insisted. He has role to play. What role? Holt demanded. He's just a child. Kime's gaze shifted to Charlie, who had emerged from the trading post and now stood beside Ayasha. Not just any child, the older man said cryptically. Son of Hannah, daughter of White Hawk Band. His blood gives him right to speak in council. Charlie's eyes widened at this information, clearly news to him. My mother was important, he asked in halting Apache. Kimi nodded gravely. Daughter of sub-chief, before she was taken to marry white man. This revelation changed the dynamics considerably. If Charlie had standing in the tribe through his mother's lineage, his presence might influence any Apache they encountered. Still too dangerous, Holt maintained, unwilling to risk the boy's life. I go, Charlie said firmly, switching to English. Is my people too. My fight too. Holt looked to Ayasha, hoping for support, but her expression told him she sided with Charlie and Kimi. Outvoted, he sighed in resignation. Fine, but you stay back when the fighting starts. That's non-negotiable. Charlie nodded solemnly, though something in his eyes suggested he might have his own ideas on the matter. We ride now, Kami decided, turning his horse. Others wait in Arroyo to south, Needle Canyon by dawn. As they prepared to depart, Holt pulled Ayasha aside for a private word. I'm sorry about your brother, he said quietly. Losing family, it's a wound that never truly heals. Ayasha's eyes were dry, but filled with a pain Holt recognized all too well. Apache do not weep for dead, she said. We honor them by finishing their battles. Her hand moved to the knife at her belt. Makato will pay for his treachery. This I swear. Holt nodded, understanding completely. Vengeance was a path he had walked for 15 years. He could hardly fault Ayasha for setting her feet upon it now. They mounted up and followed Kimi into the desert night, the moon casting their shadows long and dark across the ancient land. Behind them, the abandoned trading post stood silent, a momentary refuge in a journey that had become more complex and dangerous with each passing hour. Ahead lay Needle Canyon, where Vernon Hargrove, the man Holt had hunted for 15 years, awaited with his own forces. And with him, a traitor to the Apache people who had allied with their enemies for the sake of power. The wheel of fate continued to turn, drawing them all toward a confrontation that had been brewing for generations. The moon had set, and the stars blazed in the black velvet sky as their small party rode south. After meeting up with Kimi's warriors in the Arroyo, they now numbered 10, Holt, Ayasha, Charlie, Kimi, and 6 Apache fighters, whose silent efficiency spoke of years of experience in guerrilla warfare. They traveled in single file with an Apache scout leading and another bringing up the rear. No one spoke. Communication was limited to hand signals and occasional soft whistles that mimicked desert birds. Even the horses seemed to understand the need for stealth, their hoofbeats muffled by cloth wrapped around their feet, an old Apache trick that Holt remembered from his scouting days. Keem rode beside Holt, occasionally pointing out landmarks visible only to the most experienced eyes. Despite his age, the older Apache sat his horse with the ease of one born to the saddle. His movements fluid and economical. How far to Needle Canyon? Holt asked in a low voice during a brief rest to water the horses. 2 hours, Kimi replied, his eyes on the southern horizon. We'll reach before dawn. And Hargrove's men? Many, Keme said grimly. 20, maybe more. Plus Makato's followers, perhaps 10 warriors. He spat on the ground at the mention of the traitor's name. Not true Apache. Men without honor. Holt nodded, calculating the odds. 30 armed men against their 10. Not good, but not impossible, with the element of surprise and superior knowledge of the terrain. "What's your plan once we get there?" he asked. Kimi's weathered face showed a hint of surprise at being consulted. "Watch first," he said after a moment's consideration. "Learn enemy positions' strengths. Then strike where they least expect." It was sound strategy one that Holt himself would have proposed. He nodded approval. "And Nasha, the old storyteller." "First priority," Kime confirmed. "She is treasure more valuable than gold. Knows all old ways, all sacred stories." As they prepared to mount up again, Ayasha approached her face, composed once more, though her eyes still held the shadow of grief for her slain brother. "Charlie sleeps," she reported, nodding toward where the boy had curled up beneath a stunted mesquite tree. "Exhausted but strong. Boy has spirit of warrior," Kimi observed. "Like his mother." Ayasha's expression softened at the mention of Charlie's mother. "Hannah was kind woman," she said. "Gentle soul, not warrior." "Gentle, yes," Kimi agreed, "but strong in her way. Refused to surrender Apache ways even when taken to live among whites." He glanced at Holt. "Not all strength shows in battle." Holt nodded, thinking of his own wife, Margaret, a woman whose quiet fortitude had been the bedrock of his life, until illness took her. True enough. They roused Charlie, who woke instantly alert, and continued their journey south. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached the foothills of the mountains where Needle Canyon lay. Massive rock formations loomed against the star-filled sky, their shapes suggesting fantastic beasts or ancient guardians frozen in stone. About an hour before dawn, the lead scout returned at a gallop, his face grim as he reported to Kim in rapid Apache. The older man listened intently, then turned to Holt and Ayasha. "Riders ahead," he translated. "Many moving fast, coming this way." "Hargrove's men?" Holt asked, hand dropping to his revolver. Kimi shook his head. "Not know. Too dark to see clearly." "We should take cover," Ayasha suggested, pointing to a nearby ravine that offered concealment. Kimi gave orders in Apache, and the small party quickly moved off the trail into the shelter of the ravine. They dismounted, securing the horses and taking positions that offered both concealment and fields of fire if it came to a fight. Holt found himself beside Charlie, who had drawn the revolver Holt had given him earlier. Gently, the older man placed his hand over the boy's, lowering the weapon. "Not yet," he said quietly. "Wait and see who they are first." Charlie nodded, his young face serious in the pre-dawn darkness. "Could be Makato's men," he whispered. "Looking for Ayasha." "Could be," Holt agreed. "Or Reed's men, or someone else entirely. Deserts full of travelers with their own business." They didn't have to wait long. Within minutes, the sound of approaching horses became audible, a large group moving at a steady trot, rather than a gallop. As they drew closer, voices became distinguishable, speaking in English rather than Apache. "Telling you Hargrove's gone too far this time," one voice was saying. "Kidnapping an old woman, stirring up the Apaches again. Territory's finally starting to settle down, and he wants to reignite the whole damn war." "Man knows what he's doing," another voice countered. "Always has. Got us through the war, didn't he? War's been over a long time, Simmons. Some folks seem to have forgotten that." The speakers came into view, a group of perhaps 15 riders, their forms indistinct in the pre-dawn gloom, but clearly not Apache. They wore the clothes of settlers and ranchers, with a few sporting what looked like old military coats. Beside Holt, Kim tensed, raising his rifle. Holt placed a restraining hand on the older man's arm. "Wait," he whispered. "Something's not right." The group of riders had stopped in the middle of the trail, apparently consulting about their direction. Their leader, a tall figure on a distinctive white horse, was gesturing toward the mountains, his voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. "Needle Canyon's that way about 5 miles. If Hargrove's got a base there like the Apache said, that's where we'll find him." Holt's eyes narrowed at these words. These men weren't with Hargrove. They were looking for him, just as Holt's group was. "Townsman," Ayasha whispered, having crept closer to listen. "From Redemption, I think." Holt nodded slowly, recognition dawning as he made out more details in the growing light. "That's Jack Hollister on the white horse," he said. "Owns the largest ranch in the county. No friend of Hargrove's, if I recall correctly." "What they want with Hargrove?" Kim asked suspiciously. "Only one way to find out," Holt decided, standing up from his concealed position. Before anyone could stop him, he called out, "Hollister, Jack Hollister!" The group of riders immediately wheeled toward the sound weapons appearing in their hands with the practiced speed of men accustomed to frontier life. Their leader, the man on the white horse, called back cautiously, "Who's there? Show yourself. Holt Morgan." Holt replied, stepping out onto the trail with his hands raised to show he meant no harm. "Been a while, Jack." There was a moment of silence, then a bark of surprised laughter. "Morgan, by God, it is you." Hollister rode forward, lowering his rifle. "Heard you might be out this way. Been looking for you." "That's so." Holt kept his tone casual, though his mind was racing with questions. "Must be important to bring you and your boys all the way out here." Hollister dismounted, approaching on foot, a gesture of trust that Holt appreciated. The rancher was a big man in his 50s with a full beard gone mostly gray and the weathered complexion of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "It is important," Hollister confirmed grimly. "Hargrove stirred up a hornet's nest this time. Kidnapped an Apache elder, got the whole tribe on the warpath. Word is, he's holed up in Needle Canyon with that snake, Makato, and a bunch of gunmen." We know," Holt said simply. "We're headed there ourselves." Hollister's eyes narrowed, taking in Holt's trail-worn appearance. You alone out here, Morgan." In answer, Holt gestured toward the ravine where Ayasha had now emerged, followed by Charlie and Keem. The other Apache warriors remained hidden, a precaution that Holt silently approved. Hollister's eyes widened at the sight of Ayasha and Keem, his hand twitching toward his holstered revolver, before he visibly controlled the reflex. "I see," he said carefully. "You've found some unusual allies." "Times change," Holt replied evenly. "Question is, what brings you and your men out here looking for Hargrove? Last I heard, you were content to mind your own business on that big spread of yours." Hollister's expression darkened. "That was before Hargrove and his new deputies started throwing their weight around, demanding special taxes for protection, threatening folks who don't comply." He spat on the ground. "Man's turning the whole county into his personal kingdom." "And folks finally got fed up," Holt surmised. "Ruby Wilson got fed up," Hollister corrected with a grim smile. "After what Reed and his boys did to her store when she wouldn't pay up." His eyes hardened. "Nearly killed her grandson, too. Boy's only 12. Holt felt a chill at this news. Ruby Wilson had been a fixture in Redemption for decades, respected by all. An attack on her would indeed galvanize the community in a way few other things could. "Ruby all right?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Tough as old leather, that woman," Hollister replied with grudging admiration. "Got shot in the shoulder but still managed to fill one of Reed's boys with buckshot before they fled." He glanced at the growing light on the eastern horizon. "She's the one who told us you might be out here, actually. Said you and an Apache woman had come through town asking questions about Hargrove." Holt exchanged a look with Ayesha, who had moved to stand beside him. "That was days ago," he said. "We haven't been to town since." Hollister frowned. "Strange. Ruby was quite specific. Said you came in yesterday morning asking where Hargrove might be holed up." A cold suspicion formed in Holt's mind. "Describe the man she saw." "Tall gray hair, scout's build," Hollister recited. "Riding a chestnut Mustang with a white blaze. Traveling with an Apache woman." He shrugged. "Sounds like you to me." "Someone impersonating us," Ayesha said quietly. "Setting trap." Holton nodded, the pieces falling into place. "Hargrove's trying to flush us out or lead us into an ambush." He turned back to Hollister. "Jack, you and your men are riding into a trap. Hargrove knows you're coming." Hollister's expression hardened. "Maybe so, but we're coming anyway. Man's gone too far this time." "Noble but foolish," Kimi interjected, speaking up for the first time. "Hargrove has many men good positions. You ride in blind, you die." Hollister eyed the older Apache with a mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. "And I suppose you have a better plan." "We do," Holt confirmed. "Or at least the beginnings of one." He gestured to the eastern sky, now lightening with the approach of dawn. "But we need to move soon. Mind if my friends join us?" At Holt's signal, the 6 Apache warriors emerged from hiding their faces, impassive as they regarded the white settlers. A tense moment followed as both groups assessed each other, generations of mutual suspicion not easily set aside. It was Charlie who broke the tension, stepping forward with the natural confidence of youth. "You fight Hargrove," he said in careful English. "We fight Hargrove too. Same enemy." Hollister looked down at the boy, something softening in his weathered face. "Out of the mouths of babes," he murmured, then nodded decisively. "All right, Morgan. Your Apache friends can ride with us, but I want your word they're here for Hargrove, not to settle old scores with us." "You have it," Holt assured him, knowing Kimi's warriors would follow their leader's directives. "Now, let's find some cover and talk strategy. Dawn's coming fast, and we need to be in position before Hargrove's men spot us." As the two groups converged, an unlikely alliance forming in the pink light of dawn, Holt couldn't help but reflect on the strange turns his quest for vengeance had taken. What had begun as a personal mission had somehow transformed into something larger, a cause that had united people who would normally regard each other with suspicion or outright hostility. Whether this newfound alliance would be enough to overcome Hargrove and Makato remained to be seen. But for the first time in 15 years, Holt felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. As they moved off the trail into the shelter of a nearby wash, Ayesha fell into step beside him. "Strange times," she observed quietly. "Apache and white men riding together." "Strange times indeed," Holt agreed. "But maybe necessary ones." Ayesha nodded, her dark eyes reflecting the growing light of a new day. "My grandmother had saying, when old enemies stand together, great spirit is at work." Holt considered this, watching as Keem and Hollister bent over a crude map drawn in the sand, already discussing approach routes to Needle Canyon. "Let's hope your grandmother was right," he said softly. "We're going to need all the help we can get." Needle Canyon earned its name from the tall, slender rock formations that rose from its floor like stone spires reaching for the sky. In the first light of dawn, these natural monuments cast long shadows across the canyon floor, creating a landscape of light and darkness that seemed both beautiful and foreboding. From their vantage point on a ridge overlooking the canyon, Holt Morgan studied the scene below through a battered brass spyglass. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Hargrove had indeed established a substantial camp in the canyon with at least 20 men visible and signs of more. Tents had been erected near the canyon's southern wall, while horses were corralled in a natural enclosure formed by the rock formations. "See anything?" Jack Hollister asked, crouching beside him. Holt handed over the spyglass. "Looks like they've been there at least a few days. Well-established camp sentries posted at all the obvious access points." He pointed to a larger tent set apart from the others. "That'll be Hargrove's if I know him. Likes to keep himself separate from the men." Hollister scanned the canyon, his expression growing increasingly grim. "There must be 30 men down there, Morgan, and they've got the high ground at every entrance." "Not every entrance," Kimi interjected, joining them at the ridge. The older Apache pointed to a seemingly solid wall of rock on the canyon's eastern side. "There is way, hidden path known only to medicine people." Hollister looked skeptical. "Through solid rock." "Not solid," Kimi replied with dignity. "Only appears so. Ancient water-carved passage long ago. Narrow, difficult, but passable." Holt nodded slowly, memories from his scouting days resurfacing. "I've heard of such things. Apache are masters at finding paths where none seem to exist." "Can you show us this path?" Hollister asked Kimi directly the first time he had addressed the Apache elder without going through Holt. Kimi's weathered face remained impassive, but he inclined his head slightly. "I can, but not for all. Too narrow for many men." "A small strike team, then," Holt concluded. "Hit them from behind while the main force creates a diversion at the canyon entrance." Hollister considered this, then nodded his agreement. "Who goes in the strike team?" "Me," Holt said immediately. "I know Hargrove know how he thinks." "I go also," Ayasha stated, her tone brooking no argument. "For my brother's memory, for my people's sacred places." Kime nodded. "I will guide. No path well." "I should go too," Hollister began, but Holt shook his head. "Your men respect you, Jack. They'll need your leadership for the diversion." He glanced at the growing light. "Besides, you're not exactly built for squeezing through narrow passages." Hollister chuckled ruefully, patting his substantial girth. "Fair point." He sobered quickly. "But who else, 3, doesn't seem enough for what you're planning." "I go," Charlie's voice came from behind them. The boy had approached so silently that even Keem looked impressed. "Know how to move quiet. Small enough for narrow places." Before Holt could object, Keem spoke. "Boy has right. Blood of chiefs flows in his veins." "He's a child," Holt protested, unwilling to put Charlie in such danger. "I am Apache," Charlie countered with quiet dignity. "My mother's people fight for what is right. I fight too." Holt looked to Ayasha, hoping for support, but she merely regarded Charlie with solemn respect. "Boy has chosen warrior's path," she said simply. "Cannot dishonor his choice." Trapped by their logic and the proud determination in Charlie's young face, Holt reluctantly nodded. "Fine, but you stay behind us, understand, no heroics." Charlie's expression remained serious, but his eyes glinted with satisfaction. "I understand." With the strike team decided, they retreated from the ridge to rejoin the main group, where Hollister's men and Kimi's warriors waited in an uneasy alliance. The plan was quickly communicated. Hollister would lead the main force in a frontal assault on the canyon entrance at mid-morning, creating maximum noise and confusion. Meanwhile, Holt's smaller team would enter through the secret passage, locate Nasha, and, if possible, neutralize Hargrove and Makato. "What about Nasha?" one of Hollister's men asked. "How will you find her in all that chaos?" "She will be kept separate," Kime answered. "Valuable prisoner, not with common men, likely near Hargrove's tent." "And if she's not?" Hollister pressed. Ayasha's expression hardened. "Then we keep searching until we find her. She must not be abandoned again." As the larger group prepared for their diversionary attack, Holt drew Hollister aside for a private word. "Jack, if something goes wrong, if we don't make it out—" "You'll make it," Hollister interrupted gruffly. "But if we don't," Holt persisted, "there's something you should know about Hargrove, something I've never told anyone." He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. 15 years ago at Whispering Creek, it wasn't just a military operation gone wrong. Hargrove had a personal agenda. He was looking for something, a map to an Apache sacred site called the Valley of Souls. Hollister frowned. "A map, all this for a map." "Not just any map," Holt explained. "One leading to a place where the Apache have hidden their tribal treasures for generations. Gold, silver, sacred artifacts, enough wealth to make a man powerful beyond imagining." Understanding dawned in Hollister's eyes. "So that's why he's kidnapped this Nasha woman. She can read the map." Holt nodded. "Holt, if Hargrove finds the Valley of Souls, he won't just have wealth, he'll have a way to control the entire territory. Make sure that doesn't happen, Jack, whatever else occurs today." Hollister clasped Holt's shoulder, his grip firm. "We'll stop him, old friend, one way or another." With final preparations made, the strike team prepared to depart. Kime would lead, followed by Holt, then Ayasha with Charlie bringing up the rear. Each carried only essential weapons and supplies. Anything that might impede their movement through the narrow passage was left behind. As they prepared to leave, Ruby Wilson's grandson appeared with a small bundle. "Miss Ayasha," the boy said shyly, offering it to her. "Grandmother said you might need these." Ayasha unwrapped the bundle to reveal a collection of small vials containing powders and liquids. A healer's kit. She looked at the boy with surprise and gratitude. "Thank you," she said simply. "These may save lives today." The boy nodded solemnly. "Grandmother says to tell you that not all white people think like Hargrove. Some of us remember that this land belonged to your people first." With that simple statement, he rejoined Hollister's men, leaving Ayasha momentarily speechless. Holt, watching her expression, saw something shift there, a softening perhaps, or a small seed of hope taking root. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Ayasha secured the precious vials in her pouch and nodded. "Ready." Led by Kime, the strike team departed, moving along the ridge until they were well past the canyon's eastern wall. There, hidden by scrub brush and the natural contours of the land, they began their descent toward the secret entrance Kime had described. The entrance to the hidden passage was so well concealed that Holt would have walked past it a dozen times without noticing. It appeared to be nothing more than a shallow indentation in the rock face, partially obscured by desert scrub and fallen boulders. Only when Kime carefully moved aside a specific arrangement of stones did the true opening become visible, a narrow crevice barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. "Ancient ones made this path," Kime explained in a hushed voice, "for escape during times of war. Knowledge passed only to medicine people and chiefs." Holt eyed the opening dubiously. "You're sure we can get through there?" Kime's leathery face creased in what might have been amusement. "For Apache, yes. For big white man." He shrugged expressively. "We will see." With that less than reassuring assessment, the older Apache slipped into the crevice and disappeared from view. After a moment's hesitation, Holt followed, turning sideways to navigate the narrow opening. The passage beyond was dark and claustrophobic, with walls of rough stone pressing in on both sides. In places, the rock face was adorned with faded pictographs, stylized figures, and symbols whose meanings had been lost to all but a few. "What do these mean?" Holt whispered to Keem, who moved ahead with the confidence of one who had traveled this path before. "Sacred stories," the older man replied without turning. "Creation tales, history of the people." His voice dropped even lower. "And warnings. Warnings about what? About those who would violate sacred places." Keemy's tone suggested this was not a subject for further discussion. They proceeded in silence after that, their progress slow but steady. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes widening enough to walk normally, other times narrowing until they had to squeeze through sideways. In a few places, they were forced to crawl on hands and knees through tunnels that seemed impossibly tight. Behind Holt, Ayasha moved with the fluid grace of one born to this harsh landscape, while Charlie brought up the rear, his small size an advantage in the confined space. Despite Holt's concerns, the boy showed no signs of fear, his young face set in determined concentration. After what felt like hours, but was probably less than one, Keemy halted, raising a hand for silence. Ahead, a faint glow indicated the passage was nearing its end. The older Apache turned to the others, speaking in a whisper, barely audible even in the confined space. "Passage opens near Sacred Pool," he explained. "Center of canyon, but hidden by rocks and trees. Must be very quiet now. Hargrove's men everywhere." Holt nodded, understanding. Drawing his revolver, he checked it one final time before following Keem toward the light. As they approached the exit, the sound of voices became audible, men talking, occasional laughter, the general noise of a busy camp. Keem moved with exaggerated caution, now testing each step before committing his weight, making no sound that might alert those outside. The passage ended in another narrow crevice, this one concealed from the canyon side by a large boulder and a stand of stunted juniper trees. Keem paused at the opening, peering out carefully before signaling the others to join him. The view that greeted them was both better and worse than Holt had anticipated. They had indeed emerged near the center of the canyon, in a small, secluded area surrounding a natural spring, the sacred pool Keem had mentioned. Crystal clear water bubbled up from beneath the earth, forming a shallow pool before disappearing again underground. The area was partially screened from the main camp by rock formations and vegetation, allowing them to observe without being immediately spotted. What they saw confirmed their worst fears. Hargrove's operation was larger and more organized than it had appeared from the ridge. Men moved with military precision, obviously well-trained and disciplined. Near the largest tent, a group of Apache men lounged, Makato's followers, distinguishable by the red bands they wore around their arms. And there, seated outside Hargrove's tent, under guard, was an elderly Apache woman, Nasha, the storyteller. Even from a distance, the signs of mistreatment were evident in her posture and the way she held herself. But there was no defeat in her bearing. She sat straight-backed and proud, her ancient face a mask of dignified endurance. "Nasha lives?" Ayasha breathed relief evident in her voice. "Not broken." "Strong woman," Keemy agreed. "Keeper of old ways, will not surrender secrets easily." Holt's attention, however, had fixed on a figure emerging from the large tent, a tall, silver-haired man, whose bearing spoke of absolute authority. Vernon Hargrove. Even after 15 years, Holt would have known him anywhere. The man who had ordered the massacre at Whispering Creek. The man who had shot Holt in the back and left him for dead. The focus of Holt's quest for vengeance for a decade and a half. Something cold and hard settled in Holt's chest at the sight of his old enemy, not the hot rage he had expected, but a crystalline clarity of purpose. This was the moment he had worked toward for 15 long years. Yet strangely, vengeance no longer seemed the driving force it once had been. There was something else now, a desire for justice broader than his personal grievance, a need to right wrongs that went beyond his own suffering. As they watched, another figure joined Hargrove, a younger Apache man dressed in a mixture of traditional clothing and white man's attire. His bearing was arrogant, his face handsome, but marred by cruelty around the mouth and eyes. "Makato!" Ayasha hissed, her hand moving unconsciously to the knife at her belt. "Traitor to his people, murderer of my brother." The two men were speaking to Nasha, their postures aggressive despite the old woman's obvious frailty. Though they couldn't hear the words, the nature of the conversation was clear, demands met with stubborn refusal. Finally, Hargrove made a gesture of disgust and turned away, while Makato leaned down to say something directly into the old woman's ear, something that made her flinch despite her stoicism. "We must move soon," Kimi urged. "They grow impatient. We'll harm her more." Holt checked the position of the sun. It was approaching mid-morning, Hollister, and his men would begin their diversion soon. "We need to get closer," he decided. "Be ready to move when the attack starts." They retreated slightly into the passage to confer without risk of being overheard. Holt quickly outlined his plan. When Hollister's diversion began, they would use the confusion to reach Nasha. Kime and Charlie would help the old woman back through the passage, while Holt and Ayasha dealt with Hargrove and Makato. "No," Charlie said unexpectedly, his young voice firm despite its softness. "I stay and fight, too." Before Holt could argue, a commotion erupted in the camp, but not from the direction they had expected. Instead of coming from the canyon entrance, the sounds of shouting and gunfire came from the opposite end, near where the horses were corralled. "That's not Hollister," Holt muttered, peering out at the suddenly chaotic scene. Men were running toward the disturbance, weapons drawn. "Something's gone wrong." Through the confusion, he spotted Hargrove barking orders, directing his men with the confidence of a seasoned commander. Makato had disappeared, but Nasha remained where she had been, temporarily forgotten in the chaos. "Now," Holt decided, "this may be our only chance. Kame, you and Charlie get to Nasha. Ayasha and I will cover you." Without waiting for agreement, he slipped out from their hiding place, using the natural cover provided by the rocks and vegetation to advance toward Hargrove's tent. Ayasha followed close behind, moving with the silent grace of a hunting cougar. They had covered perhaps half the distance when a shout went up. They had been spotted. Gunfire erupted around them, bullets whining off the rocks as they dove for cover. "Go!" Holt shouted to Keem and Charlie, who had been following. "Get to Nasha! We'll hold them off!" The old Apache and the boy darted away, using the confusion to circle around toward the captive storyteller. Holt and Ayasha, meanwhile, returned fire, forcing Hargrove's men to seek their own cover. Through the chaos, Holt caught glimpses of Hargrove directing his men from the relative safety of a large boulder. The old hatred surged, tempting him to take a shot. But the distance was too great for accuracy with a revolver, and he couldn't risk wasting ammunition. Beside him, Ayasha fired with surprising skill, her shots precise and effective. Two of Hargrove's men already lay motionless on the ground, while others nursed wounds. "We need to move," Ayasha urged. "Too exposed here." Holt nodded, scanning for better cover. A cluster of rocks about 20 yards to their left offered better protection and a clearer line toward Hargrove. "There," he indicated. "On my signal, run. I'll cover you." Ayasha tensed, ready to move. Holt raised his revolver and fired rapidly, forcing the closest gunmen to duck. "Now." Ayesha sprinted for the rocks, moving in a zigzag pattern that made her a difficult target. Bullets kicked up dust at her heels, but she reached the shelter unscathed. Once in position, she returned the favor, laying down covering fire, while Holt made his own dash to safety. As he dove behind the rocks, a bullet grazed his arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a burning furrow across his bicep. Ayesha immediately tore a strip from her shirt, binding the wound with practiced efficiency. "Not bad," she assured him. "Flesh wound only." Holt nodded thanks, already scanning the battlefield. To his dismay, he saw that Kim and Charlie had been pinned down before reaching Nasha. They had taken cover behind a water trough, but were surrounded on three sides by Hargrove's men. "They need help," he muttered, calculating angles and distances. Before they could move, however, a new sound joined the cacophony of battle war whoops from the canyon entrance, followed by the thunder of hooves. Hollister's diversion had finally arrived, albeit later than planned. The newcomers burst into the canyon like an avenging tide. Hollister's ranchers and townsmen mixed with Kimi's Apache warriors, an unlikely alliance, charging together into the fray. The effect on Hargrove's men was immediate. Caught between two forces, their disciplined defense began to crumble. Hargrove himself seemed to recognize the shifting tide. Holt saw him retreat toward his tent, shouting orders that were lost in the general chaos. A moment later, he emerged with a small leather satchel clutched in one hand. "He's running," Holt realized aloud. "Probably has a bolt hole planned." Sure enough, Hargrove was making for a narrow trail that led up the canyon wall, a secondary exit that Holt had noted during his initial survey, but had seemed too steep for practical use. "Go," Ayesha urged. "Stop him. I will help Kim and Charlie." Holt hesitated, torn between his personal quest and his concern for his companions. Ayesha made the decision for him, pushing him roughly in Hargrove's direction. "Go is your fight to finish." With a nod of acknowledgement, Holt broke cover, running in a crouch toward the path Hargrove had taken. Gunfire followed him, but the general confusion of the battle worked in his favor, the shots going wide as he zigzagged across the open ground. Reaching the base of the trail, he began to climb his old bones, protesting the steep ascent. Ahead, he caught glimpses of Hargrove moving with surprising agility for a man his age, the leather satchel clutched tightly in his grasp. What Hargrove didn't know, couldn't know, was that Holt Morgan had spent years mapping every inch of this territory. He knew that the trail Hargrove had chosen ended in a box canyon with no exit other than the way they had come. The man was literally climbing into a trap of his own making. This knowledge allowed Holt to pace himself, conserving strength for the confrontation to come. As he climbed, the sounds of battle below grew more distant, replaced by the whisper of wind through the rocks and the rasping of his own breath. Near the top, the trail widened into a small plateau before narrowing again to enter the box canyon. Holt paused there, catching his breath and checking his revolver. 4 bullets left. It would have to be enough. Drawing a deep breath, he stepped around the corner and into the canyon proper. It was smaller than he had remembered, perhaps 50 yards across at its widest point, with sheer walls rising on 3 sides. At the far end, Vernon Hargrove stood with his back to the wall, a revolver in his hand, the satchel at his feet. For a long moment, the two men regarded each other in silence, former commander and scout, now mortal enemies. Hargrove looked older than Holt had expected, his once handsome face lined with the marks of ambition and cruelty. But his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, utterly without remorse. "Morgan," Hargrove finally said, his voice, as Holt remembered it, smooth, educated, with the faint accent of old Virginia. "I thought you were dead." You made sure of that, Holt replied, keeping his revolver trained steadily on the other man. Shot me in the back and left me to the vultures. Hargrove shrugged as if the attempted murder was a minor discourtesy. You turned on your own men, on your country. What did you expect? I expected a lawful military operation, Holt countered, not the massacre of women and children. Casualties of war, Hargrove dismissed, necessary sacrifices for the greater good. What greater good? Your personal enrichment. Holt took a step closer, his voice hardening. I know about the map, Hargrove, about the Valley of Souls, about what you've been searching for all of these years. Something flickered in Hargrove's eyes, surprise quickly masked. Always we're too clever for your own good, Morgan. He gestured toward the satchel at his feet. But it doesn't matter now. I have what I came for. The old woman finally broke. The thought of Nasha being forced to betray her people's sacred trust filled Holt with cold fury. You won't live to use it, he stated flatly. Hargrove's smile was reptilian. Perhaps, but neither will you. Without warning, he raised his revolver and fired. Holt was already moving, diving to the side as the bullet whined past his ear. He rolled behind a boulder, returning fire in a single fluid motion. His shot caught Hargrove in the shoulder, spinning the older man around, but not dropping him. First blood to you. Hargrove acknowledged, his voice tight with pain. But I've survived worse. So have I, Holt replied grimly, thanks to you. They circled each other warily, two old predators in a final confrontation. Each knew the other's capabilities, each respected the other's deadliness. It was Hargrove who broke the stalemate, firing twice in rapid succession. One bullet struck the rock near Holt's head, sending stone splinters slicing across his cheek. The other missed entirely. Holt's return fire was more measured, a single shot that caught Hargrove in the leg, dropping him to one knee. The older man cursed, but maintained his grip on his weapon, firing again, even as he fell. This shot found its mark, tearing through Holt's side in a burst of white-hot pain. He staggered, but remained standing, his revolver steady despite the blood now soaking his shirt. Seems we're both hard to kill, Hargrove observed, pressing a hand to his bleeding leg. But only one of us is walking out of here, Morgan. No, came a new voice from the canyon entrance. Neither of you is. Both men turned to see Makato standing there, a rifle in his hands, and a cold smile on his handsome face. Behind him, two of his followers blocked the only exit from the box canyon. Makato. Hargrove acknowledged, his tone wary, despite their supposed alliance. Come to offer assistance. The Apache's smile widened, revealing teeth, white and perfect in his bronze face. Not exactly, old friend. Come to claim what is mine. His gaze flicked to the satchel. The map, the knowledge, the power it represents. Understanding dawned in Hargrove's eyes. A double cross. I should have expected it. Yes, Makato agreed pleasantly. You should have, just as you should have known better than to trust an Apache after what you did at Whispering Creek. Holt, still pressing a hand to his bleeding side, saw the situation deteriorating rapidly. Two wounded men against Makato and his armed followers, not odds he liked. But perhaps there was a way to turn the Apache's betrayal to advantage. He used you, Holt called to Makato, just like he uses everyone. Once he has what he wants, you'll be disposed of too. Makato's cold gaze shifted to Holt. Perhaps, but he will not have that chance. The rifle in his hands rose, pointing at Hargrove. The map, old man, now. Hargrove's face twisted with fury, but he was in no position to resist. Reaching down with his uninjured arm, he grabbed the satchel and tossed it toward Makato. Take it then, you treacherous savage, but it won't do you any good. Only I can read it properly." Makato laughed a sound devoid of humor. "That is where you are wrong. I have studied with missionaries, learned your writing and ways, and I know the old symbols of my people." His smile faded. "I have no further use for you, Hargrove, or for the gray wolf who hunts you." The rifle swung between the two wounded men, Makato clearly deciding which to eliminate first. In that moment of hesitation, Holt saw movement behind the Apache, a small figure darting silently from rock to rock. Charlie! The boy had somehow followed them up the trail, evading Makato's followers with the stealth of his Apache ancestors. Now he crouched behind a boulder, a revolver clutched in his small hands, his young face set in lines of grim determination. Holt needed to keep Makato's attention away from the boy. "The woman," he said loudly. "Nasha, what have you done with her?" Makato's smile returned cruel and satisfied. "The old one, she served her purpose. Once she revealed the secrets of the map, her usefulness ended." "You killed her?" Holt asked, genuine horror in his voice. Nasha was not just an elder, but a living repository of Apache culture and knowledge. "Not yet," Makato replied. "Death is too quick, too merciful for one who betrayed our sacred trust, even under torture." He shrugged. "She will die slowly, knowing she failed her people." Behind Makato, Charlie had now crept close enough to act. Holt saw the boy raise his revolver, aiming not at Makato, but at one of his followers blocking the exit. The gun barked once the sound startlingly loud in the confined space. The follower dropped, clutching his leg and howling in pain. In the moment of confusion that followed, several things happened at once. Holt dove for cover, firing his last bullet at Makato. Hargrove, seizing the opportunity, rolled behind a rock, coming up with his revolver aimed at the traitorous Apache. And from the canyon entrance came a new figure, Ayasha, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, but moving with deadly purpose, her knife in hand. "Brother killer!" she cried, hurling herself at Makato with the fury of 15 years of grief and rage. Makato twisted away, bringing his rifle to bear, but Ayasha was too close, too fast. Her knife flashed in the sunlight, finding its mark in Makato's shoulder. He howled in pain, staggering backward, the rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. The remaining follower, seeing his leader under attack, raised his own weapon only to be tackled from behind by Charlie, the boy's small body colliding with the man's knees and sending him sprawling. Hargrove, seeing his chance, fired at Makato. The bullet grazed the Apache's head, leaving a bloody furrow across his temple. Makato fell dazed but not dead, the precious satchel tumbling from his grasp. Holt, bleeding heavily now, crawled toward the fallen satchel. His hand closed around the leather strap, just as Hargrove lurched toward it from the other side. For a moment, their eyes met over the contested prize, old enemies linked by blood and history and the object that had caused so much suffering. "Let it go, Morgan," Hargrove growled. "It's mine. I've earned it." "With the blood of innocence," Holt replied, his voice steady despite his wounds. "It ends here, Hargrove, all of it." With a surge of desperate strength, Hargrove lunged forward, grabbing for Holt's throat with his good hand. They grappled briefly, both men weakened by blood loss, but driven by the culmination of 15 years of hatred. In the struggle, neither noticed Ayasha approaching until she stood over them, her knife red with Makato's blood. "Enough," she said, her voice carrying the weight of command. "Both of you, enough death." Hargrove looked up, his face contorted with rage and frustration. "Kill him," he urged Ayasha. "He was part of it, part of the massacre at Whispering Creek. He helped plan it, helped execute it." "I know," Ayasha replied calmly. He told me himself. Confusion replaced rage on Hargrove's face. Then why? Because he seeks to make amends, she cut him off. While you seek only power. She knelt beside them, her dark eyes boring into Hargrove's. I am Ayasha, daughter of Chief White Hawk, sister of Nakohe, whom your ally murdered. I have the right of blood vengeance against you. Hargrove's face paled, understanding dawning. You're from Whispering Creek, a survivor. I was away when you came, Ayasha confirmed. But I returned to find my family, my people slaughtered. For this. She picked up the satchel, her expression contemptuous. For gold and power. What will you do? Hargrove asked, an edge of fear entering his voice for the first time. Ayasha considered him for a long moment. Among my people, a life for a life is justice. Your death would balance many scales. Her knife moved to Hargrove's throat. But I have learned that death does not heal wounds. It only creates new ones. With a swift movement, she cut not Hargrove's throat, but the strap of the satchel he still clutched. You will face white man's justice for your crimes, she declared. In a court before witnesses. The truth of Whispering Creek will be known to all. Relief and disappointment warred on Hargrove's face. And if their justice fails, if I walk free. Ayasha's smile was cold. Then, an Apache justice will find you. This I promise. From the canyon entrance came sounds of approach. Hollister and his men, having secured victory below, were coming to find them. Ayasha helped Holt to his feet, supporting his weight as his wound continued to bleed. It's over, she told him quietly. After 15 years, it's over. Holt nodded, feeling a strange lightness despite his pain. The burden he had carried for so long, the need for vengeance, the weight of guilt, seemed to lift from his shoulders like morning mist burned away by the sun. What about the map? He asked, nodding toward the satchel now in Ayasha's possession. She glanced down at it, then back at him, a hint of a smile touching her lips. Some secrets should remain secret, she said simply. Some sacred places undisturbed. As Hollister and his men appeared at the canyon entrance, led by Keem, supporting a frail but very much alive Nasha, Holt felt something he had not experienced in 15 long years' peace. Not complete, not perfect, but real nonetheless. The wheel of fate had turned full circle, and in that turning perhaps lay the beginning of healing for himself, for Ayasha, for the land, and people who had suffered so much for so long. The wounds might never fully heal, but they had begun at last to close. The desert bloomed under a gentle spring rain, wildflowers carpeting the red earth in a riot of color. From the porch of the newly rebuilt ranch house, Holt Morgan watched the shower with quiet appreciation, his weathered face relaxed in a way it had not been for decades. The past year had brought changes he could never have anticipated. Hargrove's trial had been the sensation of the territory, with Holt's testimony about Whispering Creek finally bringing the truth to light. Justice had been served. Hargrove would spend the rest of his life in prison for murder and conspiracy, while the surviving members of his operation had scattered to the winds. Makato had faced a different kind of justice. Returned to the tribe for judgment by his own people, he had been sentenced to permanent exile, a living death for an Apache. Last Holt had heard, the once proud warrior had been seen working as a manual laborer in a mining camp near the border, his arrogance broken, his dreams of power shattered. The ranch had flourished under its new arrangement. With Hollister's help, Holt had expanded his modest operation, adding more cattle and improving the irrigation systems. But the most significant change was in the people who now called it home. Ayasha had chosen to stay, establishing a small clinic that served both the local settlers and Apache from the nearby reservation. Her knowledge of traditional medicine, combined with what she learned from the territory's white doctors, made her services sought after by people who would once have shunned her. And Charlie, no longer the frightened, half-starved boy they had found in the desert, had thrived. Now 14, he divided his time between school in town, where Ruby Wilson kept a watchful eye on him, helping with the ranch and learning the traditions of his mother's people, from Kimi and Nasha, who had also made the ranch their home. It was an unconventional family formed not by blood, but by shared experience and mutual respect. Holt, who had thought himself destined to live out his days in solitude, found himself surrounded by life and purpose once more. The door opened behind him, and Ayasha stepped out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Holt before settling into the chair beside his, her movements graceful despite the old injury to her shoulder, a souvenir of their final confrontation with Makato. "Rain brings good medicine," she observed, sipping her coffee. "Flowers will be strong this year." Holt nodded, enjoying the comfortable silence that had developed between them, a silence that needed no filling with unnecessary words. After a while, he spoke. "Letter came from the governor today." Ayasha raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "They are establishing a new reservation boundary," Holt explained, "moving it to include the Valley of Souls." He glanced at her. Seems someone convinced them it was an important sacred site that should be protected. A small smile touched Ayasha's lips. "Governor is wise man." "Governor is a politician who knows which way the wind is blowing," Holt corrected dryly. "Territory's changing. People are starting to recognize that the old ways of doing things, the Hargrove ways, don't work anymore." "Change comes slowly," Ayasha cautioned. "Many still think like Hargrove." "True enough," Holt acknowledged. "But fewer than before." He took a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "Keme says the tribal council is considering your proposal for a school, one that teaches both Apache traditions and the skills they'll need in the changing world." Ayasha's face brightened with rare enthusiasm. "Did they approve?" "Not yet, but Nasha is advocating for it, and her word carries weight." He smiled slightly. "Having the tribe's most respected storyteller in your corner doesn't hurt." "Nasha understands what is at stake," Ayasha said solemnly. "Our children must learn to walk in both worlds, or they will be lost in either." From the distance came the sound of hoofbeats. Charlie returning from town riding the pinto pony Holt had given him for his birthday. The boy rode with the natural grace of his Apache ancestors, straight-backed and confident. As they watched him approach, Holt felt a surge of something like pride. Charlie was neither fully Apache nor fully white, but he was finding his way, creating an identity that honored both parts of his heritage. In that perhaps lay hope for the future, not just for Charlie, but for all the people of this harsh, beautiful land. "You are thinking deep thoughts," Ayasha observed, watching Holt's face, with the perception that had always unnerved and impressed him. "Thinking about wounds," he admitted. "And healing," Ayasha nodded, understanding. "My grandmother said true healing begins when we stop seeing only our own pain and start seeing the pain of others." "Wise woman, your grandmother." "Yes," Ayasha agreed. "Like you, she believed some wounds never fully heal." She reached over her hand, finding his in a rare gesture of physical affection. But she also believed that even unhealed wounds can become sources of strength, reminders of what we have survived. Holt's fingers closed around hers, drawing comfort from the contact. "I'd like to think she was right." Charlie had reached the yard now, dismounting with fluid grace, and leading his pony toward the small stable. Seeing Holt and Ayasha on the porch, he waved his young face, splitting in a grin that momentarily erased the shadows of his difficult past. "He will be great man someday," Ayasha predicted softly. "Bridge between worlds." "Already is," Holt replied, watching as the boy efficiently unsaddled his pony, speaking to the animal in a mixture of Apache and English. "Braver than most men I've known, twice his age." The rain began to ease, sunlight breaking through the clouds to create a rainbow that arced across the eastern sky. In Apache tradition, Holt knew such a sign was considered auspicious, a promise of good things to come. Whether or not that was true, he couldn't say. The future, like the desert after rain, held both promise and uncertainty. But for the first time in many years, Holt Morgan found himself looking forward to it with something like hope. The wounds of the past might never completely heal. But in their scarring, perhaps, lay the possibility of new growth, like desert flowers blooming after the rain, fragile but persistent, finding life even in the harshest of landscapes. And for now, that was enough.